She is not on the list. My brother, Trent, laughed. He leaned out the tinted window of his chauffeured black SUV, the morning mist clinging to the heavy iron gates of the naval base. In the back seat, my father, Wallace, smirked, adjusting the lapels of his tailored suit. "Leave her on the curb," my father said, his voice carrying clearly over the low hum of the idling engine. "She does not belong among actual leaders." They drove through the security checkpoint, the red taillights fading into the thick gray fog. They left me standing alone on the damp concrete. They genuinely believed I was just a mid-level Pentagon clerk, a pathetic family disappointment showing up to beg for a seat at Trent's prestigious Defense Contractor of the Year ceremony. They had absolutely no idea I was the one who personally approved the award. It was not a commendation, it was a highly coordinated trap. I watched the luxury SUV disappear down the access road. I reached for the top button of my civilian trench coat. I pulled the heavy fabric apart, letting it fall open to reveal the crisp, pristine navy whites beneath. The morning light caught the 3 silver stars gleaming on my collar. The gate guards, previously indifferent, instantly snapped to a rigid, bone-straight salute. "Welcome back, Vice Admiral Fisher," the head sentry barked, his eyes fixed straight ahead. In exactly 20 minutes, Trent would look down from the auditorium stage, see my rank, and freeze in pure, unadulterated panic right before a 4-star admiral grabbed the microphone to deliver the fatal blow. If you have ever had to outsmart toxic relatives who mistook your silence for weakness, drop your city in the comments below, hit the like button, and subscribe, because you will not want to miss this execution. To understand the sheer magnitude of their miscalculation, you must rewind exactly 3 months. I lived a ghost's life for 10 years. I operated deep within the subterranean levels of United States Navy Cyber Command. My daily reality involved dismantling hostile foreign networks, neutralizing digital espionage, and commanding a highly classified cyber task force dedicated to global maritime security. My rank was earned through blood, sweat, and absolute, unforgiving intellect in classified combat zones. To the outside world, however, my identity was entirely sanitized. To my family, I held the title of a mid-level Department of Defense acquisitions clerk. I drove a reliable, 7-year-old sedan. I wore muted wool cardigans and sensible slacks. I carried a faded canvas tote bag. My cover was designed to be profoundly boring, and it worked flawlessly. My family, conversely, operated like a blaring siren. Trent was 38 years old. He served as the chief executive officer of Fisher Logistics, a massive defense contracting firm. He wore custom-tailored Italian suits and drove a silver sports car that roared obnoxiously whenever he pulled into my driveway. He demanded absolute deference from everyone in his orbit. My father, Wallace, was 68. He was a retired defense lobbyist who had spent 4 decades greasing palms in the shadowy corridors of Washington. He funneled his dark networks directly to Trent, building a civilian military empire on government contracts, bribery, and aggressive intimidation. Wallace viewed empathy as a fatal weakness. Then there was Nolan, my husband of 7 years. He was 44, possessing a charming, practiced smile and the prestigious title of Chief Financial Officer at Fisher Logistics. I believed we shared a quiet, steady partnership. I cooked dinner. He balanced the corporate ledgers. The family dynamic was established early and rigidly enforced. At family gatherings, I was the designated punchline. 3 months prior to the ceremony, I sat at the long mahogany dining table inside Trent's sprawling, 10,000-square-foot estate. The room smelled heavily of expensive imported cigars and roasted lamb. Crystal chandeliers cast a harsh, glittering light over the heavy silverware. Wallace sat at the head of the table, swirling a glass of dark, aged bourbon. "Did you finally get that promotion to senior clerk, Maria?" Wallace asked. He did not look at me. He kept his eyes fixed on the amber liquid in his glass, his tone dripping with sheer condescension. Trent chuckled, cutting a piece of meat with aggressive, sawing motions. Dad, the government does not promote paper pushers. They just give them a new gray cubicle and a cheaper coffee machine. Trent pointed his silver fork directly at my chest. You really should have joined the private sector. Maria, Fisher Logistics cleared $40 million in pure profit last quarter. We actually build things. We supply the United States military. You just file our receipts. I set my fork down on the porcelain plate. I did not glare. I did not raise my voice or defend my intelligence. I offered a mild, practiced smile. The Navy needs clerks. Trent, someone has to process the paperwork. Nolan sat beside me. He placed a heavy, patronizing hand on my shoulder, squeezing the muscle tight enough to send a dull ache down my collarbone. Maria likes the slow pace, Nolan told the table, adopting a tone of manufactured, sickening sympathy. She gets overwhelmed easily by high-stress environments. The low stakes suit her perfectly. He patted my shoulder twice. The gesture was designed to look supportive, but it was a physical anchor, a deliberate reminder to stay small, to stay quiet. I looked at my husband. His eyes were cold, calculating, and completely detached. He turned his attention back to Trent, seamlessly transitioning the conversation to their latest ballistic armor contract. I picked up my water glass. The ice clinked sharply against the crystal. I listened. I watched the microscopic muscle twitches in Nolan's jaw when Trent mentioned their shrinking profit margins. I noticed the way Wallace tapped his gold signet ring against the mahogany wood when discussing their overseas suppliers. It was a specific nervous tic my father only displayed when attempting to mask a severe legal liability. I am a cyber warfare commander. I do not get overwhelmed. I process raw data, and the data sitting at that dining table was flashing a violent, undeniable red. The dinner finally concluded. Nolan and I drove back to our house in absolute silence. He gripped the leather steering wheel of his luxury sedan, staring straight ahead into the dark street. He claimed he was completely exhausted from managing the company's aggressive financial expansion. I nodded, playing the part of the supportive, oblivious wife. I asked him if he wanted a cup of tea before bed. He dismissed me with a sharp, irritated wave of his hand. The fragile illusion of my mundane civilian life was actively fracturing, not because I desired their toxic spotlight, but because the men in my life were growing increasingly reckless. Their arrogance was a spreading, unchecked infection. They truly believed their accumulated wealth made them untouchable. They believed my silence was genuine ignorance. They did not understand that a person trained to dismantle hostile foreign cyber threats does not complain about a minor dinner table insult. She maps the vulnerability, isolates the target, and waits for the absolute perfect moment to initiate the breach. That night, Nolan slipped under the heavy duvet within 10 minutes. His breathing deepened into a steady, rhythmic cadence. He slept soundly, completely sedated by his own massive ego, believing he had successfully put his fragile, simple wife to bed. I pushed the covers back. The hardwood floor was freezing against my bare feet as I stepped away from the bed. I did not look back at him. I walked silently down the dark hallway and stepped into my home office. I closed the heavy oak door and engaged the deadbolt with a soft, definitive click. The fragile, paranoid wife stayed outside that locked door. In the quiet gloom of the room, the shadow of the defensive clerk evaporated, leaving only the cyber warfare commander. It was time to see exactly what Fisher Logistics was hiding beneath their $40 million in profit. 3 months ago, the illusion of my marriage shattered, in the center of my home office, swallowed by the profound silence of the house. The digital clock glowing on the corner of my desk read 2:14 in the morning. I sat in the darkness, the harsh blue glow of my secure terminal washing over my face as I booted up the system. Instead of the warm tea I had offered Nolan, I held a ceramic mug of scalding black coffee, its bitterness a sharp tether to the physical world while my mind prepared to enter the digital battlefield. I initiated a routine security sweep on my localized network. When you command cyber operations for the United States Navy, treating your own home like a forward operating base becomes an inescapable reflex. I watched the diagnostic interface populate my monitors with endless, cascading lines of alphanumeric traffic. Amidst the mundane background chatter of smart thermostats and idle mobile devices pinging their host servers, a thick, erratic pulse of encrypted data caught my eye. The origin node was the media access control address registered to Nolan's personal laptop, currently resting on the granite island down in the kitchen. I set the coffee mug down. The ceramic base clicked softly against the glass surface of the desk. My husband was supposed to be sound asleep in our master bedroom. Yet, his machine was actively transmitting massive data packets to a blind server. He was utilizing a commercial virtual private network, the kind of off-the-shelf software marketed to civilians attempting to mask their browsing history. To a military cyber warfare commander, his defense mechanism was the digital equivalent of a chain-link fence. I did not march downstairs. I did not shake him awake to demand an explanation. I remained perfectly stationary, my hands hovering over the illuminated keyboard. I typed a rapid, complex sequence of commands, instructing my terminal to intercept the encrypted handshake between his machine and the external server. 6 minutes. That was all it took. He protected his hidden directory with a 256-bit encryption key, but his password methodology was pathetically predictable. I ran a targeted dictionary attack seeded with the names of his favorite sports franchises and his college graduation year. The lock snapped open. The firewall crumbled into useless code. The directories of his localized hard drive mounted directly onto my screen. I navigated past his superficial folders. I ignored the scanned tax returns, the golf club membership receipts, and the family vacation photos. I bypassed the facade of his mundane civilian existence and targeted the partitioned sector of his drive. The contents spilled across my monitors, painting a masterpiece of absolute betrayal in high-definition spreadsheets. I opened the master ledger. My eyes scanned the columns, processing the sheer staggering volume of the digits. This was not a hidden slush fund used to facilitate a cheap midlife crisis. This was a parallel economy. As the chief financial officer of Fisher Logistics, Nolan possessed unrestricted, unmonitored access to my brother's corporate treasury. The rows detailed massive, outgoing wire transfers: $2 million, $5 million, $12 million. The capital was bleeding out of the primary defense contracting accounts, vanishing into a labyrinth of phantom supply chains. I tracked the digital routing nodes. The money bounced through holding accounts in Delaware, washed through clearing houses in the Caribbean, and landed securely in sovereign trust accounts located in Cyprus. Cyprus is a notorious sanctuary for illicit capital, guarded by banking secrecy laws designed to form an iron curtain around the identities of the account holders. But money always leaves a footprint, and I specialize in hunting ghosts. I pulled the incorporation documents for the shell companies. The authorized signatories were buried beneath layers of legal obfuscation, but the structural architecture was undeniable. Nolan was not acting as a lone rogue agent. The disbursement authorizations required secondary signatures. He was working in perfect, synchronized tandem with my brother, Trent, and my father, Wallace, together. They were systematically draining the federal defense contracts dry. They were laundering United States military funding into untraceable offshore tax havens, padding their own pockets with stolen taxpayer capital. I sat perfectly still in my ergonomic chair. The harsh, white light of the spreadsheet illuminated the angles of my face. I did not gasp. I did not weep over the sudden, violent death of my 7-year marriage. The man sleeping in my bed did not love me. He required a prop. He needed the bland, unassuming government clerk to anchor his image of a stable, respectable executive. I was a human shield, completely oblivious to the fact that my home was acting as a staging ground for massive federal treason. My pulse remained a steady, rhythmic drum against my ribs. I felt a cold, absolute clarity wash over my mind, freezing the residual affection I held for my husband. He believed he was the apex predator of the financial world. He believed his offshore accounts were invisible. He believed his wife was a gullible fool. I reached for an air-gapped external drive and plugged it into my terminal. I extracted every single byte of data. I cloned the Cypress routing nodes, the phantom invoices, and the internal memos detailing the shell corporations. I moved the entire cache into a biometric vault completely detached from any network. Once the transfer completed, I systematically scrubbed my intrusion from his system logs. I wiped the network traffic history. I rebuilt the superficial firewall. I left his laptop completely undisturbed, transforming his personal computer into a pristine crime scene, waiting for the final execution. Dawn broke, casting a pale, gray light through the plantation shutters of my office. I powered down the terminal. The trap was armed. 18 hours later, the smell of seared garlic and crushed rosemary filled the kitchen. I stood at the marble island, the sharp edge of a steel chef's knife rocking rhythmically against a wooden cutting board. I diced onions, my movements precise and mechanical. The heat from the gas stove warmed the air, creating a suffocating atmosphere of domestic normalcy. The heavy oak front door swung open. Heavy footsteps echoed across the tile of the foyer. Nolan walked into the kitchen. He loosened his silk tie, exhaling a long, dramatic sigh designed to broadcast his exhaustion. He set his leather briefcase onto the counter, the exact briefcase containing the laptop I had gutted the night before. "Brutal day at the office," Nolan announced, rolling his shoulders to release the manufactured tension. "Trent is pushing the acquisitions team to the breaking point. We are finalizing the logistics for the new ballistic armor contract. The stress is unbelievable. You have no idea how complicated the private sector is." "Maria." I set the knife down. I wiped my hands on a linen towel, ensuring the blade remained safely out of my reach. I turned to face the man actively conspiring to steal millions of dollars from the military I had sworn my life to protect. I stretched my lips into a warm, practiced curve. I offered him the exact oblivious, supportive smile he expected from his fragile wife. "I am making your favorite," I said, my voice smooth and hollow. "Sit down. Let me pour you a glass of wine." 2 weeks elapsed, for 14 consecutive mornings. I drank coffee across the granite island from the man who was actively bleeding my country dry. I packed his lunches. I tied the perfect Windsor knot in his silk neckties. I kissed his cheek and wished him a productive day at the office. I executed the role of the devoted, oblivious wife with mechanical perfection. He never suspected a thing. He left for his corporate suite, and I drove my aging sedan toward the Pentagon. But my actual work environment existed far beyond the mundane gray cubicles Trent mocked at the dinner table. I bypassed the standard administrative wings. I descended 70 feet below ground level, entering the highly restricted subterranean corridors of United States Navy Cyber Command. The air down here tasted of circulated ozone and chilled copper. I swiped my encrypted proximity card at the thick steel door of the sensitive compartmented information facility. A retinal scanner projected a red grid across my right eye. The biometric lock verified my identity. The massive vault door hissed, breaking its airtight seal. I stepped across the threshold. The beige cardigan and sensible slacks I wore felt like a cheap theatrical costume. I walked down the center aisle of the command floor. Dozens of highly trained intelligence analysts and cyber warfare operators manned rows of illuminated terminals. They monitored global maritime threats, tracked hostile state actors, and fortified federal networks. As I passed, spines snapped straight, voices dropped into hushed, respectful silence. I did not stop to chat. I marched directly into my soundproof glass command module overlooking the operations floor. I sat in my reinforced ergonomic chair and booted up my primary workstation. The monitors flared to life, bathing the dark room in a stark, clinical glow. I inserted my command-level access token. I had spent the last 2 weeks analyzing the financial skeleton I extracted from Nolan's laptop. Today, I needed the operational muscle. I needed to know exactly how Fisher Logistics generated the phantom capital flooding their Cyprus accounts. I leveraged my top-secret clearance. I bypassed the civilian oversight firewalls and plunged my terminal directly into the Defense Logistics Agency procurement mainframes. The digital gates parted without resistance. I isolated the specific federal contracts awarded to Fisher Logistics over the past 3 years. My brother boasted endlessly about securing the Navy's premier infantry protection initiative, a multi-year, multi-million-dollar agreement to supply deployed service members with next-generation ceramic ballistic body armor. I pulled the logistics manifests. I ripped the shipping records from the federal servers and overlaid them with the internal corporate ledgers I had stolen from Nolan. A glaring, catastrophic anomaly materialized almost immediately. The Department of Defense requisition forms required Fisher Logistics to utilize weapons-grade boron carbide, a highly specialized, incredibly dense ceramic material engineered to shatter high-velocity armor-piercing rifle rounds upon impact. The military paid top dollar to guarantee the survival of frontline personnel. I traced the manufacturing codes. I launched a proprietary algorithm, forcing the system to map the origin points of the physical materials. Fisher Logistics submitted falsified domestic purchase orders, claiming they sourced the boron carbide from a heavily regulated facility in Ohio. But the corresponding financial disbursements painted a horrifyingly divergent reality. The money flowing out of the primary corporate accounts did not go to Ohio. It bounced through the shell companies in Delaware and vanished into the Cyprus trusts. I hacked the international shipping databases, matching the cargo container identification numbers registered to Fisher Logistics. I tracked the cargo ships backward across the Pacific Ocean. The vessels did not originate from a domestic supply chain. They launched from a loosely regulated, illicit industrial zone in Southeast Asia. I cross-referenced the manifest codes with global customs registries. My breath hitched in my throat. The screen confirmed the absolute worst. Fisher Logistics was not importing boron carbide. They were importing high-density polyethylene polymers. It was cheap. Commercial-grade industrial plastic. Trent and Wallace were operating a manufacturing sweatshop, pressing substandard plastics into the exact shape of military ballistic plates. They painted them, weighted them with cheap lead composites to mimic the required ceramic density, and shipped them directly to the United States military. They were passing off brittle plastic as life-saving armor. The financial embezzlement was merely a byproduct. The disease infecting my bloodline was outright treason. They were actively compromising the structural integrity of frontline infantry gear. They were outfitting deployed Marines and Navy personnel with defective armor that would completely disintegrate upon impact from enemy fire. They were trading American lives for the luxury sports cars idling in their driveways and the custom Italian suits draping their shoulders. Nolan facilitated the financial deception, burying the illicit polymer imports as administrative overhead, ensuring the federal auditors saw nothing but pristine, compliant ledgers. My jaw clamped shut, the muscles in my neck coiled, tightening until a dull, throbbing ache radiated up through my jawbone and into my temples. I gripped the edge of my glass desk. My knuckles turned stark white against the dark surface. I stared at the glowing shipping manifests. I envisioned a 20-year-old sailor deployed in a hostile combat zone, trusting the heavy vest strapped across his chest, stepping into the line of fire completely unaware that a greedy defense contractor had secretly stripped away his survival. The cold, analytical detachment that normally governed my cyber operations violently fractured. A visceral, burning fury rushed into the void. My own father and brother were war criminals. My husband was their eager accomplice. They were parasites feeding on the blood of the men and women I commanded. Digital files face manipulation. Highly paid corporate defense attorneys routinely discredit digital evidence in federal court, claiming server errors or sophisticated cyber attacks. I required irrefutable, physical proof. I routed the decoded manifests, the polymer import logs, the forged domestic purchase orders, and the Cyprus disbursement receipts to a secure, standalone laser printer housed within my glass module. The machine whirred to life. It rhythmically spit out stack after stack of damning, classified evidence. The sharp smell of hot toner filled the small room. I gathered the papers. The stack felt incredibly heavy in my hands, a physical manifestation of their profound betrayal. I carried the documents across the subterranean facility, ignoring the salutes of passing officers. I approached my personal biometric vault bolted to the reinforced concrete wall. I pressed my right thumb against the optical reader. The green laser scanned my prints. The heavy steel locking mechanism disengaged with a solid, metallic thud. I placed the manifests inside, stacking them with meticulous precision next to the cloned hard drive containing Nolan's encrypted ledgers. I slammed the heavy vault door shut. I spun the combination dial, locking the tumblers into place, sealing their imminent destruction in a fortress of impenetrable steel. I stood in the quiet corridor, staring at my reflection in the polished metal of the vault. The objective had fundamentally mutated. 2 weeks ago, I sought to untangle myself from a deceitful husband and a toxic family. I sought a quiet, strategic divorce. I wanted to separate my assets and walk away from their circus. That plan evaporated. This was no longer a domestic dispute. This was a massive federal takedown. The United States military does not file for divorce. It neutralizes threats. I was going to dismantle their entire defense contracting empire piece by piece. I would freeze their offshore accounts, strip their wealth, and drag their crimes into the blinding light of a federal tribunal. I would not stop until Trent, Wallace, and Nolan were completely eradicated from the free world. The psychological warfare accelerated. 4 days after I secured the classified manufacturing manifests inside my subterranean vault, my father demanded my presence at his sprawling country club estate. We sat on the flagstone patio overlooking the pristine, manicured greens of the 18th hole. The evening air felt thick, heavy with the scent of expensive cigars and aged bourbon. Wallace cut a thick slice of rare steak, the serrated blade scraping loudly against his porcelain plate. He did not look at me. He kept his gaze fixed on the rolling hills of the golf course. We are on the verge of locking in the Navy's primary logistics contract for the next 5 years. Maria, Trent said, swirling a glass of imported Cabernet with a smug grin. He leaned back in his wrought iron chair. While you're buried under folders at your desk. We are defining the future of infantry protection. It must be hard to comprehend that level of impact when your biggest daily decision is choosing which color of paperclip to use. Wallace snorted, dabbing his mouth with a crisp linen napkin. She doesn't need to comprehend it. Trent, people like her are built for routine, not risk. She has always feared the deep water. It's safer for her to stay on the shallow shore. I kept my hands resting neatly in my lap. I did not mention the substandard polymers currently endangering American infantrymen. I did not mention the shell corporations in Cyprus. I stared at the pristine white tablecloth, locking my jaw. Nolan sat directly beside me. He reached over, casually taking my water glass and placing it slightly out of my reach, before reaching up to gently pat the side of my cheek, then smoothing down a stray lock of my hair with a sigh. It was a deeply patronizing, infantilizing gesture, designed to broadcast my fragile state to the table. He offered my family a tight, apologetic grimace. Let's change the subject. Nolan sighed, his voice dripping with manufactured concern. Maria has been having a really hard time keeping her thoughts organized lately. She's been getting so confused at home, forgetting where she put her keys or when we have dinner plans. The stress of even her quiet job is starting to overwhelm her. My father shook his head in absolute disgust. Trent chuckled, taking another slow sip of his wine. I lowered my gaze, allowing my shoulders to slump. I swallowed the insults. I nodded in docile agreement, playing the role of the fragile, breaking wife. Nolan escalated his domestic sabotage over the ensuing weeks. The financial treason required a failsafe, and he needed a documented paper trail of my mental decline to discredit any potential whistleblowing or divorce claims I might launch in the future. He started with the car keys. I placed my keys on the granite kitchen counter at 6 o'clock in the evening. I turned my back to wash a single coffee mug. At 6:15, the keys vanished. I searched the countertops, opening drawers with feigned frustration. Nolan stood by the stainless steel refrigerator, shaking his head with an expression of profound, agonizing pity. He walked into the living room, reached deep between the leather sofa cushions, and pulled the metal ring free. The keys jingled in his palm. You are losing track of reality. Maria, Nolan whispered, stepping close and pressing his keys into my hand. You put them right here. You stared blankly at the couch for 10 minutes. I had not stepped foot in the living room. Next, he targeted my digital schedule. I missed a routine dental appointment and a lunch reservation with a former civilian colleague. I checked my phone calendar. The events were entirely deleted. When I confronted him in the hallway, holding my phone up as proof, he placed his hands firmly on my hips. He adopted a tone of deep, suffocating concern. You never schedule them, honey, Nolan murmured, his eyes locking onto mine with terrifying conviction. You are imagining things again. Your paranoia is getting significantly worse. You accused me of deleting them. I really think you need to seek psychiatric help. I can recommend a doctor. We need to get your mind right. A lesser woman would have screamed. A civilian would have thrown the keys at his head or shattered the phone against the wall. I did neither. I let my hands tremble. I forced moisture into my eyes, blinking rapidly until a single, convincing tear spilled over my lashes and traced a warm path down my cheek. You are right, I whispered, letting my voice crack perfectly. I buried my face against his chest, clutching the lapels of his suit jacket. I feel so confused lately. My brain feels like static. Thank you for being so patient with me, Nolan. He wrapped his arms around me, stroking my hair. He believed he had successfully broken my cognitive function. He allowed his superiority to swell, completely oblivious to the fact that his fragile, mentally collapsing wife spent her nights carving his hidden life into microscopic, undeniable pieces. While Nolan gorged on his perceived dominance, I mapped his vulnerabilities. A man arrogant enough to steal millions of dollars from the United States military rarely confines his betrayals to a single arena. I waited until the house fell dead silent. I booted up my encrypted terminal, bypassing his superficial home router firewalls for the second time. I targeted the geolocation data pinging continuously from his mobile device. He claimed he worked late at the corporate headquarters on Tuesday and Thursday evenings, crunching numbers for the logistics acquisitions. The global positioning satellites told a drastically divergent story. His device remained entirely stationary at a luxury boutique hotel located in the downtown financial district. I breached the hotel's reservation mainframe using a backdoor proxy server. I matched the billing records to a secondary credit account Nolan maintained under a false corporate subsidiary. He booked the penthouse suite twice a week, billing the exorbitant room rates to the very same shell companies laundering the defense funds. I pulled the digital security camera feeds from the hotel lobby, scrubbing the footage timestamps to align seamlessly with his check-in times. The high-definition video rendered instantly on my primary monitor. Nolan walked through the revolving glass doors. He wore his tailored suit, carrying a leather briefcase. A woman stepped out from the shadows of the lobby lounge and linked her arm through his. Simone. She was 29 years old. She served as Trent's lead political lobbyist, a woman who leveraged expensive perfume, tailored designer dresses, and aggressive charm to secure civilian military contracts on Capitol Hill. She attended our family Thanksgiving dinners. She bought me a silk scarf for my 40th birthday, smiling warmly across my dining table. Now, she was drinking vintage champagne in a penthouse suite paid for by stolen military capital, leaning her head against my husband's shoulder. I zoomed in on the surveillance feed. Simone carried a distinctive, limited edition red leather handbag. She tossed her head back, laughing at something Nolan said, incredibly eager to share in the staggering wealth Nolan extracted from my family's fraudulent empire. She left a digital footprint wide enough to drive a battleship through. I cross-referenced her communication logs. Nolan utilized a commercial burner application on his smartphone. Assuming the encrypted messages vanished securely into the ether, he did not realize that a vice admiral in Cyber Command possesses the operational architecture to intercept, capture, and decrypt cellular packets before they even reach the civilian cell towers. I captured thousands of their text exchanges. I read the transcripts scrolling rapidly across my screen. They mocked my boring, sensible wardrobe. They mocked my mediocre government salary. They discussed their accelerated timeline to liquidate the marital assets and transfer the remaining capital to Cyprus once my manufactured mental breakdown became official. Simone texted him a link to a luxury villa in a non-extradition country, asking if the weather was nice in November. Nolan replied with a heart emoji, promising her the keys the moment the new ballistic armor contract cleared the federal accounts. They were plotting a permanent escape, leaving me locked in a psychiatric facility or financially ruined on American soil. I exported the geolocation coordinates, the hotel receipts, the lobby surveillance footage, and the intercepted text messages. I compiled the digital evidence into a secondary, heavily encrypted dossier. I locked it securely alongside the ballistic armor manifests inside my subterranean biometric vault. I shut down the terminal and walked back to the master bedroom. Crawling under the duvet beside my sleeping husband, let him move my keys. Let him delete my appointments. I let them scheme, knowing I held the hammer that would shatter their entire reality into dust. 1 month before the ceremony, Nolan paced the length of our living room. He held a heavy crystal tumbler of scotch, the ice clinking sharply against the glass with every rapid step. He moved with a manic, vibrating energy. The subtle, polished restraint he usually employed to mask his corporate crimes had completely evaporated. He felt entirely invincible. Trent secured the nomination, Nolan declared. Taking an eager swallow of his drink, he pointed his index finger toward the ceiling. The Department of Defense is officially awarding Fisher Logistics the Defense Contractor of the Year commendation. They are hosting the ceremony at the naval base next month. I sat on the beige sofa, meticulously folding a wool blanket, executing the role of the docile wife. That is wonderful news, Nolan. Trent must be thrilled. Thrilled is an understatement. Maria. Nolan laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed against the vaulted ceiling. This award is a rubber stamp from the Pentagon. It completely legitimizes the supply chain. The moment the Admiral pins that medal on Trent's lapel, the oversight committees step back. We instantly lock in the renewal contract for the next generation infantry gear. He stopped pacing, turning to look out the bay window into the dark street. $1 billion, he whispered, his voice trembling with naked, unadulterated greed. A $1 billion federal commitment over the next 5 years. We are stepping into an entirely different stratosphere of wealth. I smoothed the edges of the folded blanket, maintaining my placid expression. I knew exactly what a $1 billion renewal meant for their operation. It meant thousands of additional defective polymer plates shipped to combat zones. It meant an astronomical influx of stolen taxpayer capital washing through the Cyprus shell accounts. The intoxicating proximity of his ultimate payout made Nolan careless. Arrogance breeds complacency. And an arrogant man operating within the presumed safety of his own home eventually lowers his shield. The breach occurred on a Tuesday evening. I stood at the kitchen sink, rinsing dinner plates under a stream of hot water. Nolan sat at the granite island, scrolling through his primary corporate smartphone. A second device, a sleek, matte black burner phone he presumed I never noticed, rested face down near the fruit bowl. He used it exclusively for his illicit communications, keeping it firmly in his suit pocket or locked inside his briefcase. A sharp, vibrating tone erupted from his corporate phone. He glanced at the screen, his posture instantly stiffening. "I need to take this in the study," Nolan announced, sliding off the bar stool. "It is Trent. We have a logistical snag at the warehouse." He grabbed his corporate phone and strode out of the kitchen, his leather shoes clicking rapidly against the hardwood floor. He pulled the heavy study door shut behind him. He left the burner phone sitting on the granite countertop. I turned off the faucet. The sudden silence in the kitchen amplified the ticking of the wall clock. I possessed a microscopic window of opportunity. I did not possess the luxury of hesitation. I dried my hands on a dish towel and moved toward the granite island. I retrieved a miniaturized, military-grade data extraction node from the concealed pocket of my slacks. It resembled a standard thumb drive, but it packed the processing power to strip a commercial mobile device of its encrypted data packets in seconds. I picked up the burner phone. The screen remained dark, locked behind a complex biometric and alphanumeric firewall. I did not need his passcode. I bypassed the user interface entirely. I inserted the extraction node directly into the charging port. A microscopic green light pulsed on the edge of the drive. The automated protocol engaged. The software circumvented the operating system, creating a direct bridge to the subscriber identity module and the internal flash memory. The wall clock ticked. 60 seconds. I kept my eyes fixed on the hallway leading to the study. I tracked the muffled cadence of Nolan's voice through the closed door. He was arguing with Trent, his tone sharp and aggravated. 120 seconds. The green light on the extraction node blinked rapidly, swallowing the encrypted text logs, the geolocation history, and the multimedia files. My heart hammered a steady, rhythmic cadence against my ribs. I operated with clinical, frigid precision. 180 seconds. Exactly 3 minutes. The light turned a solid, unbroken green. The transfer concluded. I yanked the node from the port, slipped it back into my concealed pocket, and placed the burner phone face down in the exact millimeter-precise position Nolan had left it. I turned my back to the island, picked up a wet sponge, and resumed scrubbing a ceramic plate. 10 seconds later, the study door swung open. Nolan marched back into the kitchen, his jaw clenched tight. He walked straight to the granite island, snatched the burner phone from the counter, and shoved it deep into his trouser pocket. He did not look at me. He did not notice the microscopic smudge on the glass screen. "Everything all right?" I asked, keeping my tone light and thoroughly unremarkable. "Fine," he snapped, turning toward the staircase. "Just civilian contractor headaches. I am going to bed." I waited until midnight. Once the steady rhythm of his snoring echoed through the master bedroom, I walked down the hall and locked myself inside my home office. I plugged the extraction node into my ghost terminal. The raw data flooded my monitors. I initiated the decryption sequence, watching the ciphertext scramble and lock into legible, chronological communication logs. The primary contact was listed under a single initial S. Simone. I scrolled through the messages, the harsh blue light washing over the severe angles of my face. The texts discarded the romantic, superficial banter I had intercepted weeks prior. The tone shifted to pure, ruthless logistics. They were actively finalizing their extraction. The Cayman broker confirmed the transfer protocols. Simone wrote on Thursday morning, "The Cyprus capital will route cleanly once the Navy cuts the initial check for the renewal. We just need the award ceremony to finalize the public optics." Nolan replied 10 minutes later, "Trent handles the stage. I handle the accounts. We liquidate the domestic holdings 48 hours after the naval base event. I booked the private charter out of Teterboro." Simone, "What about the dead weight?" I stopped scrolling, my eyes locked onto the glowing text. Dead weight. The lobbyist was referring to me. Nolan's response materialized on the screen. A chilling, calculated string of words that fundamentally shifted the parameters of my operation. "The dead weight is handled," Nolan typed. "She does not get a dime of the marital assets. I built a failsafe. I am planting the insurance policy before the ceremony. By the time I board that charter, she will be entirely neutralized. The federal authorities will keep her too busy defending her own freedom to even look at the divorce filings. They will lock her away, and I walk away clean." I leaned back in the ergonomic chair. The ambient temperature in the room seemed to plummet. I read the message again, processing the stark, undeniable threat embedded in the text. He did not intend to simply file for divorce and abscond to a non-extradition country with a stolen fortune and a young mistress. He intended to bury me. A man funneling stolen defense funds into offshore accounts requires a scapegoat to satisfy the inevitable federal audits. He needed a distraction massive enough to cover his digital tracks while he vanished across international borders. He planned to frame me. He intended to weaponize my fabricated mental instability, sacrifice me to the federal authorities, and leave me rotting in a federal penitentiary to absorb the fallout of his treason. He wanted the Department of Justice to brand me a traitor, allowing him to play the horrified, betrayed husband right up until his private jet cleared United States airspace. He planned to leave me bankrupt, imprisoned, and completely stripped of my dignity. I reached up and touched the silver chain resting against my collarbone. A grim, predatory calm settled deep within my chest. Nolan assumed I was a helpless, fragile civilian preparing to absorb a devastating abandonment. He possessed absolutely no comprehension of the catastrophic violence a cyber warfare commander unleashes when cornered. I isolated the text messages, the Cayman broker details, and the private charter flight manifest. I appended them to the master dossier inside my biometric vault. The award ceremony at the naval base was no longer just the finish line for his embezzlement scheme, it was the designated kill box. The illuminated segments of the digital clock on the nightstand shifted, glowing a harsh, crimson red. 2 in the morning. I lay on my side, staring at the blank wall. I regulated my diaphragm, drawing air through my nose for a count of 4, holding it in my lungs for a count of 4, and releasing it through my mouth for a count of 4. I executed the tactical breathing exercise to lower my heart rate, ensuring my chest rose and fell with the heavy, unbothered cadence of a woman submerged in deep sleep. The mattress depressed. The sudden absence of body heat sent a stark chill across the sheets. Nolan slipped out from under the heavy duvet. The floorboards released a microscopic groan under his weight. I kept my eyelids heavy, peering through a millimeter-thin slit. He stood beside the bed, bathed in the pale moonlight filtering through the plantation shutters. He remained perfectly stationary for a full 60 seconds, his eyes fixed on my silhouette, hunting for any disruption in my breathing pattern. I released a soft, rhythmic exhale, satisfied with his deception. Nolan turned and padded silently into the hallway. I threw the duvet aside. My bare feet met the freezing hardwood. I moved without generating a single decibel, placing the ball of my foot down before the heel, a silent infiltration technique ingrained from decades of hostile combat training. I glided down the corridor, letting the shadows swallow my form. The heavy oak door to my home office stood ajar, spilling a narrow blade of pale, artificial light across the hallway runner. I positioned myself at the hinge, angling my line of sight through the gap. Nolan sat in my ergonomic chair. He wore dark sweatpants and a black hooded sweatshirt, adopting the absurd, cinematic wardrobe of a burglar inside his own residence. He did not attempt to breach my classified terminal. That machine required biometric retinal scans and cryptographic handshakes he could never replicate. Instead, he targeted my civilian laptop, the unsecured machine I utilized for managing mundane household logistics, paying utility bills, and drafting superficial, unclassified Pentagon correspondence. He extracted a small, rectangular object from his sweatshirt pocket. It was a ruggedized, military-grade universal serial bus drive, encased in heavy shock-absorbent rubber. He inserted the hardware into the laptop port. Next, he produced a white plastic identification card affixed to a breakaway lanyard. My jaw locked. It was a Department of the Navy access token. I recognized the distinctive barcode pattern and the embedded magnetic strip. He had stolen it from my canvas tote bag weeks prior, likely replacing it with a visually identical counterfeit while I was showering. He genuinely believed that specific token granted access to the apex layers of the naval supply databases. He remained entirely ignorant of the fact that it only permitted entry to the superficial, unclassified logistics servers. However, to a civilian federal investigator executing a search warrant, that stolen token served as a damning, undeniable piece of physical evidence. Nolan typed a rapid, practiced sequence of keystrokes. He navigated to a shadow directory he had previously established deep within the hard drive of my laptop. A progress bar materialized on the screen, casting a toxic, neon green glow across his face. He initiated a massive data transfer. I leaned closer to the gap in the door, analyzing the file extensions scrolling rapidly across the display window. They were Naval Sea Systems Command schematics. He was downloading highly classified blueprints for next-generation ballistic missile propulsion systems and encrypted maritime defense grids. The entire architecture of his treason crystallized in my mind. The realization struck with the concussive force of a physical blow. He was not merely siphoning defense funds to pad a Cyprus bank account, he was actively trafficking in espionage, and he intended to designate me as the architect of the crime. The strategy possessed a breathtaking, sociopathic elegance the moment the billion-dollar renewal contract cleared the federal treasury. Nolan and Simone would board their chartered jet at Teterboro Airport. As the aircraft crossed into international airspace, routed toward a non-extradition sanctuary, Nolan would place an anonymous, untraceable call to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He would claim his mentally unstable wife exhibited erratic behavior, mentioning she hid a secure drive in her home office. I envisioned the immediate fallout. Federal tactical teams would breach my front door with a steel battering ram. Armed agents would swarm the foyer, throwing me against the hardwood floor, securing my wrists in heavy zip ties. They would tear my office apart. They would discover the stolen Navy token and the ruggedized drive loaded with stolen military blueprints. The Department of Justice would brand me a traitor to the United States. The federal prosecutors would point to the fraudulent paper trail Nolan meticulously crafted, linking the espionage to the offshore embezzlement. My fabricated mental instability would serve as the ultimate catalyst, explaining why a decorated officer suddenly fractured and sold military secrets to hostile foreign adversaries. A federal judge would strike the gavel. I would receive a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. I would vanish into a subterranean concrete cell in Leavenworth, stripped of my rank, my freedom, and my identity. Nolan would inherit the entirety of our marital estate. He would play the role of the horrified, betrayed patriot. He would file for divorce in absentia, consolidate the liquidated domestic assets, and insulate his massive embezzlement operation behind my spectacular, globally televised downfall. He sought to bury me alive to guarantee his own flawless escape. The progress bar on the laptop screen hit 100%. A quiet, synthetic chime echoed in the room. Nolan ejected the drive. He retrieved a roll of heavy, industrial-strength adhesive tape from his pocket. He reached under the thick mahogany surface of my desk. I watched his shoulder muscles strain as he pressed the ruggedized drive against the underside of the top drawer. He ripped 3 strips of tape, smoothing the adhesive over the rubber casing, securing the digital guillotine in a blind spot. The drive remained invisible to a casual observer standing in the room, but it sat perfectly positioned for a federal agent executing a comprehensive search grid. He pulled his sleeve over his hand and wiped down the laptop keyboard, methodically erasing his physical fingerprints from the keys. He powered down the machine. The screen faded to black, plunging the office back into suffocating darkness. I retreated down the hallway, melting into the pitch-black shadows of the guest bathroom. I held my breath, pressing my spine against the cold porcelain tiles as Nolan walked past the door. His footsteps were light, confident, and entirely unburdened by guilt. I waited exactly 60 seconds after he re-entered the master bedroom. I drifted back down the corridor, a ghost haunting my own residence. I slid back under the heavy duvet, positioning my body in the exact curvature I had abandoned. Nolan settled into his pillows. The mattress shifted as he pulled the blankets over his shoulder. Within 5 minutes, his breathing regulated into a deep, untroubled rhythm. He slept with the profound, undisturbed peace of a man who had just successfully murdered his wife's future. I lay in the dark, my eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. The cold, analytical detachment that governed my military career fused with a visceral, unyielding fury. He wanted a war of digital espionage. He wanted to weaponize my own home against me. I did not close my eyes for the rest of the night. I mapped the counteroffensive. Tomorrow. The trap he taped beneath my desk would become the exact mechanism that severed his head from his corporate empire. 3:30 in the morning. The digital numbers on the nightstand bled a stark, crimson light across the bedroom wall. I pushed the heavy duvet aside. The hardwood floor bit into my bare feet. A sharp shock of cold that crystallized my focus. I left the master bedroom, navigating the dark corridor without engaging a single light switch. I moved with the silent, fluid efficiency of a shadow, slipping through the heavy oak door of my home office. I crouched beneath the expansive mahogany desk. I ran my fingertips along the underside of the central drawer, tracing the rough, fibrous texture of the industrial adhesive. I located the edge of the tape. I peeled the strips backward, working with slow, deliberate precision to avoid tearing the wood veneer. The ruggedized rubber casing of the universal serial bus drive dropped into my palm. It carried a dense, physical weight. It carried my impending life sentence. I stood and crossed the room to my ghost terminal. I did not boot the civilian laptop Nolan had compromised. I activated my encrypted, air-gapped workstation. The cooling fans whirred to life, emitting a low, mechanical hum. The monitors flared, casting a harsh, pale blue light across the severe angles of my face. I inserted the stolen hardware into the port. Nolan wrapped the drive in a standard 256-bit commercial encryption wrapper. He purchased off-the-shelf security, assuming it would stall a federal forensics team just long enough for his chartered jet to clear United States airspace. I launched a proprietary military decryption algorithm. The cipher collapsed in exactly 14 seconds, the root directory mounted on my screen. I opened the primary folder. The stolen files populated the display window in a sprawling, catastrophic list: Naval Sea Systems Command schematics, high-resolution blueprints detailing the propulsion grids of nuclear submarines, classified maritime defense protocols. Nolan extracted highly sensitive, compartmentalized military intelligence. He intended to spoon-feed this cache to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, painting me as a rogue operative auctioning state secrets to hostile foreign entities. I highlighted the entire directory. I did not simply drag the files to a digital recycle bin. I executed a cryptographic purge protocol. The software overwrote the stolen schematics with randomized alphanumeric noise, executing the sequence 35 times. I eradicated every single byte of the classified blueprints, scrubbing the flash memory until the sectors resembled barren, digital static. A federal cyber technician running a recovery diagnostic would find absolutely zero traces of military intelligence. The drive sat empty, a hollow vessel waiting for a new payload. I unlocked my biometric wall vault. I retrieved the encrypted cache containing the true, unredacted architecture of Fisher Logistics. I dragged the master corporate ledgers onto the flash drive. The transfer progress bar glowed a toxic, neon green. I loaded the logistics manifests. The screen displayed the damning, undeniable proof of the defective polymer imports from Southeast Asia. I included the falsified domestic purchase orders, the shipping container identification codes, and the metallurgical test results proving the materials lacked ballistic integrity. I transferred the financial ledgers, mapping the millions of dollars bleeding out of the Department of Defense and funneling directly into the shell companies anchored in Cyprus. Finally, I opened the intercepted communication logs. I dragged the complete, chronologically organized text message history between Nolan and Simone onto the drive. I included the surveillance photographs of their penthouse suite, the receipts for vintage champagne, and the digital manifest for their private charter flight out of Teterboro Airport. I highlighted the specific text where Nolan referred to me as dead weight and outlined his plan to plant this exact digital trap to frame me. I organized the folders with clinical, unforgiving precision. When the federal authorities eventually breached this drive, they would not discover a treasonous naval officer. They would uncover a meticulously documented, irrefutable confession detailing a massive defense contracting fraud, orchestrated by a panicked chief financial officer and his arrogant accomplices. I required one final mechanism. The trap needed a trigger. If Nolan executed his anonymous tip, the authorities would confiscate the hardware and transport it to a secure evidence locker. I needed to dictate the exact moment the explosion occurred. I accessed my command-level coding repository. I engineered a microscopic, autonomous executable file, a digital tracking beacon. I embedded the malicious code deep within the boot sector of the flash drive. The payload operated on a simple, devastating logic loop. The moment anyone, a federal agent, a forensic auditor, or a terrified executive plugged the drive into a live, internet-connected terminal and initiated a directory scan. The beacon would detonate. It would silently transmit a geolocation ping directly to my secure naval server. Simultaneously, it would initiate a dark web file transfer, broadcasting the Cyprus ledgers, the defective armor manifests, and the explicit text messages directly to the unredacted servers of the Department of Justice and the Naval Criminal Investigative Service. I transformed his planted evidence into an autonomous digital bomb. I safely ejected the hardware. I retrieved a fresh roll of heavy, industrial-strength adhesive tape from my supply drawer, matching the exact width and black matte finish of the material Nolan utilized. I cut 3 fresh strips, measuring them to mirror his sloppy, frantic application. I crouched beneath the heavy mahogany desk. I pressed the ruggedized rubber casing against the wood veneer, aligning it perfectly with the faint, sticky residue left by the original strips. I smoothed the fresh tape over the drive, securing the digital snare in the exact blind spot he had chosen. I pulled the sleeve of my cardigan over my hand and rigorously wiped down the desk surface and the laptop keyboard, eradicating my physical fingerprints. I stood and powered down the ghost terminal. The cooling fan spun down, plunging the home office back into complete, suffocating darkness. I stepped out into the hallway and pulled the heavy oak door shut, leaving the deadbolt disengaged. I glided back down the corridor, the silence of the house pressing against my eardrums like a physical weight. I slid back under the heavy duvet. The mattress shifted slightly. Nolan let out a soft, oblivious sigh, his chest rising and falling in a steady, untroubled rhythm. He slept with the profound peace of a man who believed he held the winning hand, completely ignorant of the fact that I had just swapped his ammunition for a live grenade. I stared at the dark ceiling, my mind executing the final operational protocols. The digital snare was set. The bait was replaced. Tomorrow morning, he would walk into the naval base expecting a coronation. Instead, he would step onto a scaffold of his own design. The morning sun breached the horizon, casting long, pale shafts of light through the bedroom windows. The house buzzed with a manic, electrified current. Nolan did not simply wake, he sprang from the mattress, entirely possessed by the intoxicating anticipation of his impending victory. I sat on the edge of the bed, gripping the cold porcelain of a coffee mug, executing my final performance as the broken, oblivious wife. He moved through the master suite with rapid, arrogant strides. He showered, leaving the bathroom door wide open, humming a tuneless melody over the rush of the water. When he emerged, he walked directly to his cedar-lined closet. He selected a bespoke, charcoal gray suit, a garment explicitly tailored to project immense corporate power. I watched him stand before the full-length mirror. He buttoned the crisp white cotton shirt. He looped a heavy silk tie around his collar, pulling the knot tight with a sharp, aggressive jerk. He shot his cuffs, exposing gold links. The man staring back at his own reflection was not a husband preparing to celebrate a family milestone. He was an apex predator, admiring his own camouflage just before the slaughter. "You need to hurry, Maria," Nolan called out, checking the dial of his platinum wristwatch. Trent secured the primary auditorium. The press pool arrives in 45 minutes. The Secretary of Defense might send a proxy. The optics have to be absolutely flawless today. "I am almost ready," I murmured. My voice lacked inflection, a hollow echo designed to reassure him of my manufactured cognitive decline. He strode over to the bed. A thick cloud of expensive, spicy cologne rolled off his skin. He placed his hands on my shoulders, mimicking the patronizing gesture he had weaponized against me for months. "Take your time," he said, his tone dripping with fake, cloying sympathy. "Do not overwhelm yourself. If the crowds trigger your anxiety, just stay near the back of the room. I have to sit on the stage with Trent and Wallace, so I will not be able to hold your hand through the applause." I lowered my gaze to the floorboards. "I understand. I will stay out of the way." A satisfied, triumphant smirk twitched at the corners of his mouth. He patted my shoulder twice. He believed the digital snare remained securely taped beneath my mahogany desk. ticking down the seconds until my total annihilation. He believed the charter jet awaited him at the tarmac. He believed I was completely, utterly defeated. He turned and marched downstairs to pour a glass of scotch to toast his morning. I stood up. I walked to my side of the walk-in closet. I bypassed the structured blazers and sensible slacks of my fabricated civilian cover. I retrieved a heavy, drab olive trench coat. The garment was intentionally oversized, designed to swallow my silhouette, rendering me entirely unremarkable. I slipped my arms into the sleeves and fastened the large tortoise-shell buttons, transforming myself into the exact mid-level Pentagon clerk my family despised. A heavy, rhythmic rumble vibrated through the floorboards, the distinctive growl of a massive, 8-cylinder engine idling in the driveway shattered the morning quiet. I walked down the sweeping staircase. Nolan stood in the foyer, holding his leather briefcase, the exact briefcase he used to transport his encrypted burner phone and offshore banking ledgers. He checked his phone, reading a fresh text message. His eyes gleamed. Simone. The lobbyist was undoubtedly waiting for him near the naval base, eager to finalize their escape. I opened the heavy oak front door. The morning air carried a sharp, damp chill, cutting through the thin fog rolling off the manicured lawn. A stretched, black luxury sport utility vehicle sat idling against the curb. The tinted windows rolled down with a soft mechanical hum. Trent leaned out of the rear passenger compartment. He wore a navy pinstripe suit, his hair slicked back with ruthless precision. He flashed a brilliant, predatory smile, gripping the leather door handle. Wallace sat directly beside him, his heavy features set in a permanent scowl. My father gripped a silver-tipped walking cane, tapping it impatiently against the floor mats. I stepped out onto the concrete porch, pulling the collar of my trench coat up against the cold mist. I walked down the brick pathway, moving toward the rear door of the vehicle. Trent laughed. The sound was sharp, brittle, and entirely devoid of warmth. "She is not on the list," Trent announced, gesturing vaguely toward my drab coat. "We requested clearance for executive personnel and immediate stakeholders. The military police are locking down the perimeter for the ceremony. They are not processing basic civilian staff today." I stopped walking. I stood on the damp concrete, a mere 3 feet away from the heavy chrome door handle. Wallace leaned forward, his face emerging from the shadows of the plush leather interior. He looked me up and down, his eyes narrowing with profound, unfiltered disgust. "Leave her on the curb," my father sneered, his voice projecting clearly over the rumble of the engine. "This is a billion-dollar federal commendation. The press is staging interviews. We require a unified front of absolute corporate dominance. She does not belong among actual leaders. There is no room in this car for a clerk." Nolan stepped up behind me. He did not defend his wife. He did not demand they make room. He placed his hands on my upper arms, turning me gently to face him. He executed his final performance of the betrayed, burdened husband flawlessly. He leaned in, adopting a mask of tragic, manufactured disappointment. "They are right, Maria," Nolan whispered, ensuring his tone conveyed deep, patronizing regret. "It is an incredibly high-level security event. The background checks at the gate are brutal this morning. Given your recent struggles, your forgetfulness, your paranoia, you simply would not pass the clearance protocols. The military police might flag your behavior. It would cause a massive scene." He was referencing the espionage frame job. He was actively reinforcing the narrative he planned to feed the federal authorities in just a few hours. He was telling me I belonged in a cage. I looked directly into his eyes. I did not flinch. I let my expression remain entirely blank, a hollow shell accepting its punishment. "I understand," I replied, my voice a quiet, flat monotone. Nolan leaned down. He pressed his lips against my cheek. The contact felt like a brand of freezing iron against my skin. It was the ultimate Judas kiss. "Go back inside, honey," Nolan murmured, pulling away and adjusting his heavy silk tie. "Make a cup of tea. Rest your mind. I will call you when the ceremony concludes." He turned his back on me. He climbed into the luxury vehicle, sliding onto the premium leather seats beside the men who had spent 10 years treating me like disposable garbage. The heavy doors slammed shut with a solid, absolute thud, sealing the three traitors inside their mobile fortress. The tinted windows rolled up, severing our connection. The driver engaged the transmission. The heavy tires gripped the asphalt, pulling the vehicle away from the curb. The red taillights burned through the thick gray fog, slowly fading as the sport utility vehicle turned the corner and vanished down the access road. I stood alone in the driveway. The damp morning mist settled on the shoulders of my oversized trench coat. The neighborhood was dead silent, save for the distant mournful cry of a crow perched in a bare oak tree. I did not cry. My tear ducts remained bone dry. My chest did not heave with sorrow or rejection. The absolute glacial calm of a cyber warfare commander locked my heart into a steel cage. They drove away believing they had successfully discarded a useless, fragile pawn. They drove away believing they were marching toward a coronation of untouchable wealth and prestige. I turned on my heel. My shoes clicked sharply against the wet brick pathway. I walked back up the porch steps and crossed the threshold into the silent foyer, pulling the heavy oak door shut behind me. I did not walk to the kitchen to make a cup of tea. I did not retreat to the living room to rest my mind. I marched directly up the sweeping staircase. I crossed the master bedroom, ignoring the unmade bed and the lingering, toxic scent of Nolan's cologne. I stepped into the expansive walk-in closet. I reached past the drab wool cardigans. I pushed the sensible, muted slacks aside. I slid the hangers down the metal rod, parting the civilian camouflage that had shielded my true identity for a decade. At the very back of the closet, encased in a heavy, opaque garment bag, hung my actual skin. I unzipped the bag. The distinct smell of dry cleaning solvent and starched cotton filled the small space. I pulled out my freshly pressed United States Navy service dress whites. The fabric was pristine, radiating a stark, blinding authority. I ran my fingers over the rigid collar. I traced the intricate gold braiding on the shoulder boards. And finally, I touched the heavy, polished metal pinned to the lapels, 3 solid silver stars, Vice Admiral. I stripped off the drab civilian trench coat, letting it fall into a discarded heap on the hardwood floor. I dressed with meticulous, tactical precision. I buttoned the crisp white tunic. I secured the collar. I pinned the rows of commendation ribbons to my chest. A vibrant, irrefutable tapestry of classified campaigns and neutralized global threats. I retrieved the oversized trench coat from the floor, throwing it over my shoulders to conceal the stark white uniform and the blazing rank on my collar until the absolute perfect moment. I looked at my reflection in the full-length mirror. The quiet, broken wife was completely eradicated. The woman staring back possessed eyes like chipped flint. My family wanted a high-level security event. My husband wanted a federal incident. I turned away from the mirror. It was time to give them exactly what they asked for. I turned the ignition key. The engine of my 7-year-old sedan sputtered briefly before settling into a low, uneven rattle. The steering wheel felt cold beneath my palms. I shifted the transmission into drive and pulled away from the curb, leaving the manicured lawns of my suburban neighborhood behind. Thick gray fog rolled off the harbor, swallowing the morning commute. I navigated the damp asphalt, the tires hissing against the slick pavement. I did not turn on the radio. The silence inside the cabin offered a perfect vacuum, a space to lock my mind into the precise, unforgiving parameters of a combat operation. The heavy wool of the oversized trench coat scratched against my neck, concealing the starched cotton and polished metal beneath. For 10 years, I wore this drab, civilian camouflage to protect my bloodline from the classified hazards of my profession. Today, the camouflage served a completely different tactical objective. It masked the executioner until the absolute optimal moment of the strike. The naval installation materialized through the mist, a sprawling, brutalist fortress of reinforced concrete, steel barricades, and razor wire. The perimeter projected absolute, Unyielding military dominance, a line of luxury sedans, stretch limousines, and black sport utility vehicles idled in the right lane, waiting to process through the civilian visitor checkpoint. The corporate elite of the defense sector jockeyed for position, eager to witness the crowning of Fisher Logistics. I bypassed the chaotic visitor queue. I maneuvered my rattling sedan into an overflow holding lot designated for overflow personnel. Cutting the engine, I stepped out into the biting chill. The damp air tasted of salt and diesel exhaust. I pulled the lapels of the trench coat tight across my chest, securing the oversized tortoiseshell buttons. I walked toward the primary pedestrian checkpoint, merging with the flow of administrative staff and low-level contractors holding clear plastic umbrellas. The concrete pathway funneled directly toward the heavily fortified vehicle gates. Through the shifting fog, I spotted the familiar, elongated chassis of Trent's black sport utility vehicle. The driver rolled to a halt at the primary security kiosk. A master-at-arms, clad in digital camouflage and bearing a tactical rifle slung across his chest, stepped out of the guard booth holding an electronic manifest tablet. I increased my pace. My low-heeled shoes clicked rapidly against the wet pavement. I closed the distance just as the tinted rear passenger window slid down with a soft, mechanical hum. Trent leaned his head out into the mist. He spotted me approaching the flank of the vehicle, his lips twisted into a sharp, mocking grin. He genuinely believed I had desperately followed them, driving my aging sedan across the city to beg for scraps of family inclusion at the perimeter gate. "She is not on the list." Trent laughed, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at me. He looked directly at the master-at-arms, his voice carrying the entitled, dismissive cadence of a man who believed his civilian wealth commanded federal authority. I stopped walking. I stood on the damp curb, a mere 3 feet from the chrome door handle. Wallace shifted in the shadows of the back seat. My father leaned forward, his face emerging into the gray light. He surveyed my drab wool coat and sensible shoes, his upper lip curled in profound, unfiltered disgust. "Leave her on the curb," my father said, his voice hard and uncompromising. He did not address the guard, he addressed his son, asserting his dominance over the family hierarchy. "She does not belong among actual leaders." Trent chuckled, slapping the leather interior of the door. The tinted glass rolled up, severing the interaction. The driver engaged the transmission. The heavy tires gripped the wet asphalt, pulling the vehicle through the rising barricade. I watched the red taillights bleed into the thick gray fog, slowly fading as the sport utility vehicle turned the corner and vanished down the access road toward the grand auditorium. They drove away, perfectly secure in their delusion. They drove away believing they had successfully discarded a useless, fragile pawn. I turned my attention to the gate. The master-at-arms lowered his electronic tablet. He turned his body, squaring his shoulders to block my path. He raised a gloved hand, a universal gesture demanding I halt my advance. His expression remained professional but entirely dismissive. He saw a civilian woman standing in the mist, wearing a cheap coat, attempting to follow a billionaire contractor through a restricted military perimeter. "Ma'am, you need to step back," the guard commanded, his voice projecting firm, unwavering authority. "This is a restricted access point. Unless you hold a Level 4 clearance or possess a verified invitation on this manifest, you cannot proceed beyond this line. Please return to the civilian reception center." I did not step back. I did not argue or attempt to explain my presence. I raised my hands to the collar of the oversized trench coat. I grasped the top tortoiseshell button. I slipped it through the buttonhole. I moved down to the second, then the third. The heavy wool fabric parted. I rolled my shoulders back, letting the drab, civilian camouflage slide down my arms and fall into a discarded, wet heap on the concrete curb. The morning mist suddenly felt irrelevant. The stark, blinding white of my United States Navy service dress uniform cut through the gray fog like a blade. The fabric remained immaculately pressed, radiating a lethal, undeniable authority. The rows of vibrant commendation ribbons blazed across my left breast pocket, detailing a history of classified combat operations and global cyber warfare victories. The master-at-arms blinked, His gaze dropped to my collar. The morning light caught the heavy, polished metal pinned to the stark white fabric, 3 solid silver stars, Vice Admiral. The transformation defied his immediate comprehension. The timeline snapped into absolute focus. The guard's posture fractured for a microscopic fraction of a second, his brain desperately trying to reconcile the discarded civilian coat with the apex predator now standing before him. The hesitation vanished instantly, replaced by a lifetime of ingrained military discipline. The master-at-arms snapped his heels together. The sound cracked like a rifle shot across the quiet checkpoint. He locked his spine rigidly straight, throwing his right hand up in a flawless, bone-snapping salute. "Welcome back, Vice Admiral Fisher." The head sentry barked, his voice echoing with profound, unshakable respect. I did not return the salute immediately. I let the silence stretch for 3 seconds, establishing absolute dominance over the perimeter. Then, I raised my hand in a crisp, sharp acknowledgement. "Lower the barricades," I ordered, my voice carrying the freezing, clinical edge of a commanding officer initiating a strike. "Clear the primary lane." "Yes, ma'am." The guard hit a heavy red button on his control console. The reinforced steel bollards sunk into the asphalt. The heavy iron gates swung wide open. I did not wait for the civilian transport shuttles. I stepped entirely past the civilian checkpoint, crossing the threshold into the heart of the naval installation. The moment my shoes cleared the perimeter line, the shadows flanking the guard booth shifted. A specialized security detachment materialized from the mist, 4 heavily armed military police officers, clad in dark tactical gear and bearing my command insignia, stepped into the open. They did not require verbal instructions. They moved with terrifying, synchronized precision, forming a tight, protective diamond formation around me. We marched. The sharp, rhythmic click of my uniform shoes against the wet concrete synchronized perfectly with the heavy tactical boots of my security detail. We bypassed the sprawling logistics warehouses and the administrative annexes. We moved directly toward the center of the base, heading straight for the massive domed structure of the main auditorium. The air felt charged, humming with kinetic energy. The trap Nolan taped beneath my mahogany desk rested securely in a federal evidence locker. The unredacted ledgers detailing the defective ballistic armor import sat on the servers of the Naval Criminal Investigative Service. The text messages exposing the offshore shell companies anchored in Cyprus waited on the hard drives of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Trent believed he controlled the narrative. Wallace believed he controlled the wealth. Nolan believed he controlled my mind. I stared straight ahead, watching the heavy mahogany doors of the auditorium loom in the distance. They wanted a high-level security event. They wanted to humiliate me on a grand stage. I adjusted the cuffs of my pristine white tunic. I was going to detonate their reality, and I would not leave a single survivor. The interior of the grand auditorium smelled of floor wax, polished brass, and expensive cologne. Hundreds of attendees filled the tiered seating, creating a dense, suffocating canopy of background chatter. Military contractors wearing bespoke Italian suits mingled seamlessly with high-ranking officers clad in heavily metalled dress uniforms. United States senators clustered near the center aisles, shaking hands and securing campaign donations under the guise of patriotic duty. The stage dominated the front of the cavernous room, draped in heavy navy blue bunting. A massive digital screen hung suspended above the podium, displaying the gold and blue insignia of the Department of Defense right alongside the corporate logo of Fisher Logistics. The lighting remained dimmed in the seating areas, concentrating a harsh, theatrical glare directly onto the center of the stage. The environment projected absolute, unyielding federal power. It was a cathedral of defense spending, constructed specifically to consecrate billion-dollar contracts. Trent occupied the dead center of the front row. He sat leaning forward, resting his forearms on his knees, entirely consumed by the magnitude of his own perceived victory. He adjusted his silk tie, his posture radiating a smug, untouchable arrogance. He turned his head to speak to a passing defense acquisitions official, flashing a brilliant, predatory smile. He believed the entire military apparatus gathered in this room existed solely to validate his genius. To his right, Wallace leaned back against the plush velvet seat. My father gripped the head of his silver-tipped walking cane with both hands, his heavy features set in an expression of profound, satisfied greed. He watched the stage like an ancient king surveying his conquered territory. He had spent 4 decades bribing mid-level officials and bullying low-ranking officers, manipulating the shadowy corridors of Washington to build this exact moment. To Trent's left sat Nolan. My husband crossed his legs, resting a heavy crystal glass of ice water on his knee. He checked his phone every 30 seconds. He monitored the screen, his thumb swiping across the glass. Waiting for the notification confirming his chartered jet stood ready on the tarmac at Teterboro Airport. He calculated the timeline. The federal tactical teams were likely breaching the front door of our suburban home at this exact second. He imagined the splintering wood, the armed agents flooding the foyer, the discovery of the ruggedized drive taped securely beneath the mahogany desk. He pictured the metal handcuffs locking around my wrists. A quiet, venomous satisfaction warmed his chest. He took a slow sip of his ice water, savoring the taste of his impending absolute freedom. They operated as a unified triad of treason. Completely comfortable in the epicenter of the military machine, they were actively bleeding dry. I stood in the shadows of the antechamber, separated from the main auditorium by a set of massive, 20-foot mahogany side doors. My security detail flanked me. The 4 elite military police officers stood in perfect symmetry, their tactical rifles resting securely against their chest plates. I did not reach for the brass door handles. I adjusted the starched cuffs of my pristine white tunic, feeling the cool metal of the buttons against my wrists. I gave a single, sharp nod to the lead officer. He stepped forward. He gripped the heavy brass hardware and drove his shoulder forward, throwing his entire body weight into the motion. The doors did not simply open. They breached. The heavy mahogany slammed backward against the interior walls with a concussive, deafening crack. The sound severed the ambient chatter of the room like a falling guillotine. I stepped across the threshold. I left the shadows of the antechamber and entered the harsh, theatrical light of the auditorium. My United States Navy service dress whites formed a blinding, stark contrast against the dim, carpeted aisles. The silver stars on my collar caught the overhead spotlights, blazing with cold, metallic fire. The rows of combat commendations on my chest broadcast a history of classified violence and absolute command. The reaction cascaded across the room in a rapid, visible shockwave. The high-ranking naval officers seated near the entrance recognized the insignia instantly. 3 stars, Vice Admiral. They abandoned their conversations, pushing themselves out of their velvet seats. They snapped their spines straight, driving their hands to their brows in crisp, rigid salutes. The politicians and civilian contractors, sensing the sudden, violent shift in atmospheric pressure, stopped talking. The wave of suffocating silence rolled outward from my position, rolling down the tiered seating, extinguishing the laughter, the whispers, and the political maneuvering. The silence was not a gradual fading of noise. It was an abrupt, violent suffocation. Within 10 seconds, the cavernous space fell entirely, completely dead. The only sound remaining in the auditorium was the sharp, synchronized strike of my uniform shoes and the heavy tactical boots of my military police escort hitting the polished concrete floor. We marched down the descending side aisle, cutting a direct vector toward the front row. The 4 military police officers did not walk. They stalked. They operated as a single, cohesive organism, their eyes scanning the tiered seating for potential threats. Their hands rested firmly on the grips of their weapons, projecting a clear, unmistakable warning to anyone who dared step into the aisle. The crowd parted. Men and women physically recoiled, pressing their bodies against the backs of their chairs to widen the path. Trent heard the approaching footfalls. He registered the sudden, unnatural silence strangling the room. Assuming an unauthorized civilian had bypassed the security perimeter, his features twisted into an ugly, entitled sneer. He turned his head. looking over his right shoulder to identify the disruption. His eyes tracked my security detail first. He registered the armed military police, the tactical vests, the rifles. Then, his gaze shifted to the center of the diamond formation. Trent found my face. The sneer liquefied. The blood completely evacuated his cheeks, leaving his skin the color of wet ash. He stared at the pristine white tunic. His eyes climbed to the heavy, polished metal pinned to my lapels. 3 stars. The cognitive dissonance struck him with physical force. His jaw unhinged, dropping open as he struggled to pull oxygen into his restricting lungs. His brain aggressively rejected the optical data. The woman marching down the aisle was the fragile, broken clerk they had abandoned in the morning mist. She was the family punchline. She was the mediocre government paper pusher. Yet, the highest-ranking military officials in the room remained standing in rigid, silent deference to her advance. The impossible mathematics of the situation actively short-circuited his reality. His hands began to tremble violently. He gripped the armrests of his chair, attempting to push himself upright, but his legs failed to generate the necessary leverage. He remained pinned to the velvet, paralyzed by absolute, unadulterated terror. He tried to reconcile the reality of his sister with the apex military authority currently subjugating the entire room. It meant his entire life, his perceived dominance, his superiority, rested on a foundation of profound, humiliating ignorance. Wallace noticed Trent's sudden paralysis. My father turned his heavy head, following his son's line of sight. Wallace saw the stars. He saw the cold, chipped flint of my eyes locking directly onto his. Wallace released a choked, guttural wheeze. The color drained from his jowls. He knew exactly what a 3-star admiral represented in the United States Navy hierarchy. He represented unchecked, catastrophic power. My father did not attempt to stand. He clutched his silver-tipped cane, his knuckles turning stark white, his chest heaving with rapid, shallow breaths. The retired lobbyist, a man who spent 4 decades controlling every narrative, found himself trapped in a room he could no longer manipulate. Nolan was the last to look. My husband held his phone in his left hand and his crystal glass of water in his right. He turned his head, deeply annoyed by the interruption delaying his billion-dollar coronation. He saw me. He did not see the terrified, paranoid woman he had engineered. He saw a vice admiral, flanked by armed guards, bearing down on his position. He saw the executioner. The muscles in his right hand went completely lax. The heavy crystal glass slipped from his fingers. It plummeted toward the floor, striking the polished concrete. The glass exploded. Shards of crystal and a cascade of ice water scattered across the floorboards, splashing against the toes of his expensive leather shoes. The shattering sound echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. The shards of crystal scattered across the polished concrete floor, catching the harsh glare of the overhead theatrical spotlights. Ice cubes skittered outward, pooling around the toes of Nolan's expensive Italian leather shoes. He did not bend to retrieve the mess. He did not attempt to wipe the freezing water soaking into the cuffs of his tailored trousers. He remained entirely frozen in his velvet seat. His eyes locked onto the 3 silver stars pinning my collar. The shattering sound severed the last remaining threads of ambient noise in the auditorium. The suffocating quiet transformed into a physical pressure, pressing heavily against the eardrums of the 500 elite defense officials, military contractors, and politicians filling the tiered seating. Admiral Elias Thorne observed the fractured dynamic from his elevated position on the stage. At 61 years old, Thorne possessed a spine forged from wrought iron and a career defined by ruthless, unyielding accountability. He wore the service dress blues of a 4-star admiral. His chest displayed a sprawling mosaic of combat deployments, strategic victories, and commendations earned in the bloodiest theaters of modern warfare. He was a man who despised political theater, and he viewed defense contractors who prioritized profit over infantry survival as a cancer requiring immediate excision. Thorne stepped away from his designated velvet chair. He approached the center podium. His heavy, measured footfalls echoed through the public address system. the microphones capturing the sharp rustle of his uniform fabric. Behind Thorne, the massive digital projection screens cycled through the high-resolution corporate logos of Fisher Logistics. The graphics displayed a rotating, three-dimensional rendering of a ceramic ballistic armor plate, overlaid with the bold, gold lettering, Defense Contractor of the Year. The stark contrast between the digital corporate triumph blazing on the screens and the lethal, freezing tension paralyzing the physical room created a nauseating dissonance. Trent shifted in his seat. The vice of sheer panic tightened violently around his throat, cutting off his oxygen supply. Yet, his towering ego refused to entirely surrender. He desperately sought a rational explanation, a bureaucratic error, a clerical misunderstanding. He adjusted his silk tie, his chest heaving with rapid, shallow breaths. He stared at Thorne, silently begging the four-star admiral to summon the military police and remove the imposter standing in the center aisle. Thorne reached the podium. He gripped the edges of the mahogany stand with both hands, his knuckles strained against the dark wood. He leaned forward. He did not look at the teleprompter scrolling silently in front of him. He did not consult the prepared index cards resting on the ledge. He ignored the scripted, sanitized corporate platitudes entirely. Thorne directed his gaze downward, locking onto the exact center of the front row. His eyes drilled into Wallace. The retired lobbyist shrank under the weight of the four-star admiral's stare. Wallace clutched his silver-tipped cane, dragging it across the floorboards to pull it tight against his legs, utilizing the metal rod like a protective barrier. The cane trembled visibly, tapping a frantic, erratic rhythm against the concrete. The United States Navy operates on a foundation of absolute, unyielding integrity. Thorne began. His voice resonated through the towering column speakers, a deep, concussive baritone that vibrated against the ribs of every individual in the cavernous auditorium. We forge our strength in the fires of transparency, accountability, and the sacred trust we place in the men and women who wear the uniform. Thorne let the words hang in the heavy air. The military contractors seated in the surrounding rows shifted uncomfortably. The politicians ceased their whispered networking, their smiles vanishing as they recognized the volatile, dangerous shift in the atmosphere. We entrust the lives of our deployed service members to the steel we forge and the armor we procure, Thorne continued, his tone hardening into a lethal, serrated edge. We rely on our civilian partners to match our commitment. We expect honor. We demand perfection, because when a contractor substitutes that honor with avarice, when they prioritize profit margins over the survival of American infantrymen, they do not merely breach a federal contract, they commit an act of profound, unforgivable treason. Trent flinched. The word treason struck his chest like a physical projectile. The corporate chief executive officer tore his gaze away from Thorne and stared at the floorboards. His perfectly manicured fingernails dug deep into the velvet armrests of his chair, tearing the delicate fabric. He recognized the pivot. The grand ceremony was evaporating. This was no longer a commendation. This was an execution. Nolan's head whipped toward the side exits. His eyes darted frantically, mapping the escape routes out of the auditorium. He spotted the heavy mahogany doors. He saw my elite military police officers standing guard, their tactical rifles resting across their heavy ballistic chest plates, their boots planted firmly shoulder-width apart. The exits were entirely sealed. The mathematical equations finally connected in Nolan's brain. The timeline of his crimes flashed before his eyes. He realized the woman sleeping in his bed, the woman he dismissed as a clueless, fragile clerk, possessed the clearance to access his offshore accounts, the Cypress shell companies, the penthouse reservations with Simone, the ruggedized universal serial bus drive taped securely beneath the mahogany desk in our home office. He realized I did not just intercept his frame job, I engineered his absolute destruction. Nolan grabbed his chest, his fingers clutching the fabric of his tailored suit jacket as a crippling wave of sheer terror crashed over his nervous system. The trap he built for his wife had snapped shut around his own neck. Today, we gathered to recognize a defense contractor, Thorne announced, his voice slicing through the thick, terrified silence. We convene to award a commendation built on fraudulent ledgers, defective materials, and compromised logistics. We will not proceed with that charade. The Department of the Navy will not honor treason. Today, we will honor the true protector of this institution's integrity. Thorne straightened his spine. He released his grip on the mahogany podium and took a deliberate half-step backward, relinquishing the center of the stage. I call Vice Admiral Maria Fisher to the podium. The name hit the front row with apocalyptic force. Wallace released a short, guttural gasp. His chest collapsed inward as the last fragments of his reality vaporized. His own daughter, the woman he mocked, degraded, and demanded be left on the curb, held the devastating power of a 3-star flag officer. I moved. My uniform shoes clicked against the concrete floor, a sharp, rhythmic cadence shattering the suffocating quiet. I turned away from the center aisle and walked toward the stage stairs. My elite security detail halted at the base, forming an impenetrable human barricade between the stage access point and the civilian attendees. I climbed the carpeted stairs. My posture remained rigid, my spine a column of steel. I did not rush. I executed every step with the calculated, predatory patience of a commander claiming her battlefield. The stark white fabric of my service dress uniform radiated an icy, blinding authority under the theatrical spotlights. The heavy weight of the medals pinned to my chest served as a physical reminder of the decades of classified combat I endured to reach this exact platform. I crossed the stage. Admiral Thorne met me at the center. He did not offer a handshake. He snapped his heels together and delivered a crisp, flawless salute. I returned the salute, my hand cutting the air with razor-sharp precision. Thorne stepped aside, allowing me to take the podium. I gripped the edges of the mahogany stand. The wood felt smooth and cool beneath my palms. I stood elevated above the auditorium, commanding the physical and psychological high ground. I looked directly down at the front row. I stared at the 3 men who spent 10 years treating me like disposable garbage. I stared at the father who sneered at my existence. I stared at the brother who mocked my intellect. I stared at the husband who attempted to bury me in a federal penitentiary. The silence in the auditorium was absolute. Nobody coughed. Nobody whispered. The collective breath of 500 attendees hung suspended in the chilled, circulated air. I did not blink. I did not offer them a single trace of sorrow, pity, or hesitation. I looked at Trent's trembling hands. I looked at Wallace's gray, sweating face. I looked at Nolan's panicked, bloodshot eyes. They stared back at the executioner. I leaned into the microphone. The black metal mesh grazed my lower lip. The proximity generated a microscopic squeal of audio feedback that died instantly, leaving only the magnified, crisp resonance of my controlled breathing broadcasting across the cavernous auditorium. I did not yell. I did not require volume to shatter their world. I projected my voice with the cold, surgical precision of a scalpel severing an artery. Fisher Logistics built an empire on a carefully curated illusion, I stated. My tone offered zero inflection, stripped entirely of theatrical outrage or sorrow. For over a decade, this corporation leveraged political connections to secure the most lucrative defense contracts in the United States military arsenal. You applauded their profit margins. You celebrated their supply chain efficiency. You gathered here today to place a medal upon their chest. I paused, sweeping my gaze across the senators, the defense acquisitions officials, and the uniformed officers sitting in the tiered rows behind my family. Today, you will examine the exact lethal cost of that efficiency. I retrieved a small, encrypted remote trigger from the breast pocket of my pristine white tunic. I depressed the primary button. The massive digital projection screen suspended above the stage flickered. The gold and blue corporate logos of Fisher Logistics vanished. A sprawling, high-resolution spreadsheet materialized, illuminating the dim auditorium in a harsh, unforgiving white glare. "Look at the screens," I commanded. Hundreds of heads snapped upward. The ambient rustling of fabric and shifting weight ceased entirely. These are the classified logistics manifests detailing the procurement of the next-generation infantry ballistic armor. Department of Defense regulations strictly mandate the use of weapons-grade boron carbide to ensure the survival of deployed personnel facing high-velocity impacts. I pressed the remote again. The screen zoomed in on a specific column, highlighting the text in a violent, neon red. On the 14th of August, and again on the 22nd of September, Fisher Logistics authorized massive imports from an unregulated industrial sector in Southeast Asia. They did not import boron carbide. They imported high-density polyethylene polymers. They imported cheap, commercial-grade industrial plastic. I let the words sink into the heavy air. A collective, sharp intake of breath swept through the upper tiers. The uniformed officers, men and women who commanded the very troops wearing that armor, bristled. Their spines stiffened with absolute rising fury. United States senators, recognizing the political toxicity of the revelation, physically distanced themselves from the front rows, pulling their aides closer. They bypassed domestic quality control, I continued, maintaining my relentless, icy cadence. They painted the brittle plastic. They weighted the plates with cheap lead composites to mimic the required ceramic density. And they shipped them directly to our frontline infantry. They traded the lives of American service members for profit margins. Down in the front row, Wallace slumped heavily in his velvet chair. My father dropped his silver-tipped cane. The metal shaft clattered loudly against the concrete floor. Rolling away from his trembling loafers, he clutched his left hand over his chest, his thick fingers digging frantically into the fabric of his expensive suit jacket. The blood entirely evacuated his face, leaving his heavy jowls a sickly, mottled gray. A sheen of cold, clammy sweat erupted across his forehead. He gasped, his lips turning a pale shade of blue as the sheer, undeniable magnitude of his federal exposure crushed his cardiovascular system. The 40 years he spent bullying and bribing his way through the shadowy corridors of Washington dissolved in front of his eyes. I did not summon medical personnel. I did not offer a shred of filial concern. I pressed the remote a third time. The financial architecture supporting this treason is equally meticulous, I announced, my voice slicing through the rising, furious murmurs of the crowd. The screens shifted again, displaying the offshore banking ledgers I had extracted from Nolan's encrypted partition. The capital allocated for the ceramic armor bled out of the primary corporate accounts. It bounced through shell entities in Delaware before vanishing into sovereign trust accounts anchored in Cyprus. The exact, unredacted digits flashed on the massive screens above my head. $12 million transferred on the 4th of October. I read, locking my eyes onto Nolan. $17 million wired on the 12th of November. The transactions carry the digital authorization signatures of the chief financial officer sitting in the front row. Nolan shrank back into his seat, throwing his hands up over his face as if physically shielding his retinas from the glowing numbers. The water from the shattered crystal glass soaked into his trousers, but he remained paralyzed, pinned to the velvet by sheer, unadulterated terror. The executives sitting before you orchestrated a systematic, multi-million-dollar embezzlement ring, I stated, delivering the final, crushing blow. They laundered stolen taxpayer capital while actively outfitting our military with defective, lethal equipment. The pressure in the auditorium reached a critical mass. The polished illusion shattered completely, leaving the raw, ugly truth bleeding under the theatrical spotlights. Trent could not endure the suffocation. His towering, narcissistic ego violently rejected the reality of his own execution. He scrambled out of his front row seat. His polished leather shoes slipped against the ice and shattered crystal scattered near Nolan's feet, causing him to stumble awkwardly. He caught his balance, lunging toward the edge of the stage, thrusting his manicured finger toward my face. "She is insane," Trent screamed. The raw, hysterical pitch of his voice tore through the dignified atmosphere of the military installation. Spit flew from his lips as his jaw unhinged. "Turn off those screens. This is a complete fabrication. She has lost her mind." He abandoned his polished, untouchable corporate persona, reverting instantly to the desperate, gaslighting tactics he and Nolan had weaponized against me for months. He turned his back to the stage, appealing frantically to the crowd of senators. defense contractors, and admirals. "Look at her! Look at my sister! She is deeply unwell!" Trent shrieked, his chest heaving, his face flushing a violent, mottled crimson. "She suffers from severe paranoia. She fabricated these documents out of pure, jealous spite because she works a pathetic desk job while we build actual wealth. This is a psychiatric break. She hacked a federal system to frame us." He spun back toward the wings of the stage, searching desperately for the 4-star admiral. "Admiral Thorne, arrest her. She is a rogue, unstable woman having a meltdown. She is hallucinating." I did not flinch. I did not step away from the mahogany podium to defend my sanity. I did not raise my voice to shout over his pathetic, frantic display. I stood perfectly still. My spine remained a rigid column of steel. My hands rested lightly on the edges of the stand. I allowed his frantic shouts to echo off the vaulted ceiling, bouncing off the concrete walls in a chaotic, desperate cacophony. The elite military police officers flanking the stage shifted their weight, tightening their grips on their tactical rifles, preparing to neutralize the threat advancing on their commander. I offered the lead officer a slight, imperceptible shake of my head. "Hold the line, let him burn." I let the heavy, unforgiving silence of the audience swallow his lies. The 500 attendees watched the chief executive officer of Fisher Logistics unravel into a sweating, hyperventilating mess. No one rushed to his defense. No one offered a murmur of support. They looked at the indisputable forensic data blazing on the screens, and they looked at the frantic, cornered rat screeching on the floorboards. I looked down at Trent. My eyes remained like chipped flint, completely unmoved by his panic, watching the fire consume his empire to ash. Trent's voice cracked. His frantic, high-pitched screams collided with the heavy, unyielding silence of the auditorium, dying in the chilled air. He swiped a trembling hand across his sweating forehead, staring at the tiered seating. The 500 defense officials and military contractors did not rush to comfort the billionaire. They did not shout down the vice admiral. They stared at the undeniable forensic data illuminating the massive digital screens. Trent's knees buckled. He fell back against the edge of the stage, grasping his head, his expensive navy pinstripe suit wrinkling as his empire evaporated. Nolan pushed himself out of his velvet seat. He stepped around the shattered crystal glass and the freezing puddle soaking the floorboards. His tailored suit clung to his sweating back. He analyzed the exits. The elite military police held the heavy mahogany doors, their tactical rifles resting across their chest plates. The offshore capital remained anchored in the Cyprus trusts. The private charter idled on the tarmac at Teterboro Airport. He required a catastrophic distraction to breach the perimeter. He needed to deploy his failsafe. Nolan squared his shoulders, attempting to resurrect the facade of the commanding chief financial officer. He stepped forward, pointing his index finger directly at the mahogany podium. His hand trembled with a toxic cocktail of adrenaline and pure panic. "Arrest her!" Nolan bellowed. He projected his voice toward Admiral Elias Thorne, who stood silently in the wings of the stage. "Do not look at those fabricated spreadsheets. She engineered them to cover her own crimes. She hacked the logistics servers." I observed the desperate pivot. He was playing his final, meticulously crafted card. "My wife is a rogue operative," Nolan shouted, his chest heaving as he addressed the audience, leveraging every ounce of his corporate charisma to sell the lie. "She suffers from severe psychological instability. Her mind has fractured. I witnessed her access a classified federal database at 2 o'clock this morning. She utilized a stolen Department of the Navy access token to download restricted blueprints." A sharp, collective gasp rippled through the tiered seating. Whispers erupted among the high-ranking officers. Espionage constituted a capital offense. The allegation was a live grenade tossed into the center of a military installation. "She stole Naval Sea Systems Command schematics," Nolan continued, feeding the fabricated narrative to the crowd, his confidence swelling as the attendees reacted to the explosive accusation. She is auctioning next-generation maritime defense grids to hostile foreign entities. She intends to defect to mask her mental breakdown. The proof sits in our home right now. Send the Naval Criminal Investigative Service. Send the tactical teams. He took a deep breath, delivering the precise, geographical coordinates of his planted evidence. She concealed a ruggedized, military-grade universal serial bus drive inside her home office. It is taped directly beneath the center drawer of her mahogany desk. Search the property. Nolan dropped his arm, gasping for oxygen. He stared at the military police, waiting for them to break their defensive formation, waiting for them to rush the stage and secure my wrists in heavy zip ties. He expected chaos. He anticipated the immediate deployment of federal agents to our suburban residence. He calculated that the ensuing investigation would grant him the 48-hour window he required to slip past the blockade, board his jet, and vanish across international borders. He looked up at the podium. He searched my face for panic. He hunted for the frantic, wide-eyed terror of a cornered, unmasked traitor. He found a terrifying, glacial smile. The edges of my lips curved upward, forming a sharp, predatory expression entirely devoid of human warmth. I did not grip the edges of the mahogany stand. I did not raise my voice to frantically deny the allegations. I let the silence stretch for 5 agonizing seconds, allowing his accusations to settle into the permanent federal record. A ruggedized, military-grade universal serial bus drive, I repeated. My voice was a quiet, lethal echo slicing through his manufactured hysteria. Concealed beneath the center drawer of the mahogany desk in the home office. Nolan blinked. His chest hitched. The smile on my face triggered a primal, klaxon alarm deep within his nervous system. Yes, Nolan stammered, his fabricated authority suddenly fracturing. I saw you hide it. Thank you, Nolan, I stated, my tone dropping to a freezing whisper that resonated through the column speakers. Thank you for confirming the exact physical location of the hardware. You just provided the federal investigators with a public, recorded confession. I retrieved the encrypted remote trigger from my pocket. I rested my thumb against the primary button. Let us examine the classified intelligence you just described. I depressed the button. The massive digital projection screens suspended above the stage blinked. The logistics manifests and Cyprus routing numbers vanished. A new directory materialized, illuminating the auditorium in a harsh, unforgiving glare. The audience leaned forward in their velvet seats. They expected to see stolen ballistic missile schematics. They expected to see encrypted submarine propulsion grids. Instead, a series of high-resolution surveillance photographs flooded the screens. Nolan walked through the revolving glass doors of a downtown luxury boutique hotel. A woman stepped out from the lobby shadows, linking her arm through his. The next slide displayed a digital receipt for a penthouse suite, billed directly to a Fisher Logistics Shell subsidiary. The camera zoomed in on the woman's face. Simone, Trent's lead political lobbyist. Nolan's jaw dropped. The blood completely evacuated his head, leaving his complexion a sickly, translucent white. I pressed the remote again. The photographs vanished, replaced by a sprawling, chronological transcript of text messages. The text bubbles expanded, rendering the font large enough for the senators in the back row to read with absolute clarity. The Cayman broker confirmed the transfer protocols. The message from Simone read, "The Cyprus capital will route cleanly once the Navy cuts the initial check for the renewal. We just need the awards ceremony to finalize the public optics." The crowd gasped. The sound rolled through the auditorium like a sudden, violent shift in barometric pressure. The politicians who had previously championed Fisher Logistics physically recoiled, recognizing the catastrophic legal fallout of the text exchange. The screen scrolled downward, highlighting the next message in a toxic, neon red. It was Nolan's direct reply. "The dead weight is handled. She does not get a dime of the marital assets. I built a failsafe. I am planting the insurance policy before the ceremony. By the time I board that charter out of Teterboro, she will be entirely neutralized. The federal authorities will lock her away, and I walk away clean." I pressed the remote a final time. The screens shifted to display a digital flight manifest. A private charter jet, scheduled to depart Teterboro Airport at 0800 hours the following morning, booked under Nolan's alias, routed toward a nation possessing zero extradition treaties with the United States. Nolan staggered backward. His expensive leather shoes slipped on the wet concrete. He bumped into the empty velvet chair, his knees buckling under the sheer, crushing weight of his exposed reality. He stared at his own words blazing on the screens above my head. The ruggedized drive taped beneath the mahogany desk did not contain classified naval blueprints. It contained his absolute destruction. "You plan to weaponize federal law enforcement to cover your embezzlement," I announced, my voice carrying the terminal weight of a judge reading a death sentence. "You intended to frame a commanding officer of the United States Navy to facilitate your escape." Nolan clutched his chest, his breathing reducing to rapid, shallow wheezes. He looked at Admiral Thorne. He looked at the military police sealing the exits. He looked at the 500 witnesses staring at his exposed treason. "You did not plant an insurance policy, Nolan?" I said, locking my cold, chipped flint eyes onto his panicked gaze. "You planted a digital tracking beacon the moment you taped that drive beneath my desk. You handed the Department of Justice the exact coordinates of your own execution." The final syllable hung suspended in the chilled, circulated air of the auditorium, a terminal decree echoing across the vaulted ceiling. Before Nolan could even draw a breath to formulate a defense, the physical manifestation of his execution arrived. The towering mahogany doors at the extreme rear of the auditorium did not simply open, they detonated inward. The heavy brass hardware slammed against the drywall with a concussive, deafening crack, fracturing the plaster. A tidal wave of federal authority flooded the center aisle. Dozens of heavily armed tactical agents surged into the cavernous space. They moved with terrifying, synchronized velocity. A relentless machine composed of ballistic vests, utility belts, and rigid discipline. The harsh, theatrical lighting caught the bold, block lettering plastered across their windbreakers: Naval Criminal Investigative Service, Federal Bureau of Investigation. The synchronized pounding of their heavy combat boots against the concrete floor created a low, rolling thunder. They did not shout. They did not issue polite commands to the crowd. They operated in absolute, lethal silence, communicating through sharp hand signals and ingrained tactical training. The 500 civilian contractors, politicians, and military officials occupying the tiered seating scrambled to clear the path. Senators pressed their spines flat against the velvet upholstery, pulling their legs out of the aisles, desperate to physically distance themselves from the radioactive blast zone of a massive federal raid. The elite defense establishment recognized the terminal velocity of the operation. Nobody reached for a cell phone. Nobody uttered a word of protest. They simply held their breath and watched the empire of Fisher Logistics burn to ash. The federal swarm descended the primary staircase, dividing into two distinct columns to encircle the front row. The military police officers who had escorted me into the auditorium seamlessly integrated with the incoming raid, stepping outward to lock down a secondary, impenetrable perimeter around the perimeter of the stage. The trap snapped completely, utterly shut. Wallace Fisher recognized the checkmate. At 68 years old, the patriarch of the corrupt dynasty watched 4 decades of bribery, intimidation, and untouchable corporate power vaporize in a matter of seconds. His legs, already trembling, buckled entirely. He collapsed backward into his plush velvet seat. He did not attempt to run. He possessed nowhere to go. The sheer crushing weight of his federal exposure collapsed his chest. His heavy jowls sagged, losing all structural integrity. Tears breached the corners of his eyes, carving jagged tracks through the cold. Clammy sweat coating his face, he wept openly, sobbing with the visceral, agonizing grief of a man mourning the sudden death of his own freedom. He mourned the country club estates. He mourned the private jets. He mourned the politicians he once owned. 2 federal agents flanked his chair. They grabbed his arms, hauling his dead weight upward, Wallace offered zero physical resistance. He hung between the agents like a discarded rag. A tactical officer secured his wrists, pulling his hands firmly behind his back. The sharp, metallic ratchet of the heavy steel handcuffs locking into place cut through the sound of his pathetic, broken weeping. The mechanism secured his future inside a federal penitentiary. Trent, however, violently rejected the reality of his subjugation. At 38 years old, his towering, malignant narcissism overrode every basic survival instinct he possessed. He refused to accept that a woman he spent 10 years degrading had just orchestrated his absolute annihilation. As an agent reached for his shoulder, Trent thrashed wildly. He swung his arms, his expensive silk tie whipping frantically around his neck. He kicked his polished leather shoes against the concrete floor, attempting to break the tactical grip. "Get your hands off me!" Trent shrieked, his voice cracking into a raw, hysterical register. He spat the words, his face contorting into an ugly, feral mask. "I am a civilian. You have absolutely no jurisdiction. I demand my attorneys. I hold billion-dollar federal contracts. You cannot touch me. I know the Secretary of Defense." He believed his wealth shielded him from the physical consequences of his treason. He believed he could litigate his way out of a tactical raid. The federal agent did not care about his bank accounts. The agent recognized a combative, non-compliant suspect resisting a federal warrant. The officer neutralized the threat. He grasped the collar of Trent's bespoke navy pinstripe suit and the heavy leather of his belt. With a sudden, explosive burst of kinetic force, the agent drove Trent forward. Trent's feet left the floorboards. He flew through the air, traveling the short distance between the front row and the elevated platform. His face smashed directly against the hard, wooden edge of the stage. The impact drove the oxygen entirely from his lungs, replacing his arrogant screams with a choked, agonizing gasp. The sharp wood splinters bit into his cheek, tearing the skin. The custom tailoring of his Italian suit ripped at the seams, exposing the white cotton beneath. 2 additional agents converged on his pinned form. They drove their knees into the small of his back, utilizing their full body weight to crush him against the unyielding wood. They wrenched his arms backward, forcing his wrists together. Trent kicked his legs, his designer shoes scraping uselessly against the concrete. But the tactical restraint held firm. The steel cuffs snapped shut. The chief executive officer of Fisher Logistics lay immobilized, his cheek pressed against the stage, his mouth tasting the dust of his own shattered empire. Nolan watched his accomplices fall. At 44 years old, the manipulative, calculating chief financial officer lost all cognitive function. The offshore Cyprus trusts vanished. The private charter jet waiting on the tarmac at Teterboro Airport faded into a pipe dream. Simone, the young lobbyist waiting to share in his stolen fortune, would soon face her own federal indictment. The escape route died. The money evaporated. Nolan dropped to his knees. He sank to the floorboards, landing directly in the freezing puddle of water and the jagged shards of crystal from the glass he had shattered minutes prior. The sharp fragments penetrated the fabric of his tailored trousers, biting deep into the flesh of his kneecaps. He did not feel the physical pain. His nervous system remained entirely consumed by blinding, unadulterated terror. He stared up at the mahogany podium. He stared at the 3 silver stars pinned to my collar. Nolan clasped his hands together in front of his chest, pressing his palms tight in a gesture of desperate, pathetic supplication. "Maria," Nolan whimpered, his voice a ragged, hollow rasp. He ignored the federal agent swarming his flanks. He ignored his brother-in-law bleeding against the stage. He focused the entirety of his shattered existence on the woman he had spent months trying to destroy. "Please," Nolan begged, tears spilling hot and fast down his cheeks. He crawled forward a few inches, dragging his bleeding knees across the concrete, desperate to close the distance. "Please stop this. Call them off. I had no choice. Maria, they manipulated me. Trent forced me to sign those ledgers. Wallace threatened me. I was terrified of them. I never wanted to hurt you. I love you." He utilized his final breath as a free man to spin one last, desperate lie. He attempted to leverage the ghost of a marriage he had already murdered. I stood perfectly still behind the mahogany stand. I did not reach for the microphone. I did not broadcast my response to the silent, watching auditorium. I stepped out from behind the podium. I walked to the very edge of the stage, stopping directly above his cowering, kneeling form. I looked down at the man who had hidden my car keys, deleted my appointments, and attempted to send me to a subterranean cell in Leavenworth. My posture remained a rigid column of steel, my eyes, hard and cold as chipped flint, locked onto his frantic, bloodshot gaze. I leaned forward, closing the physical distance. I dropped my voice to a sharp, freezing whisper, ensuring the acoustics carried the syllables exclusively to his ears. "You are just imagining things, Nolan," I murmured, feeding the exact toxic poison he utilized against me directly back into his veins. "You are losing your grip." The remaining color drained completely from his face. His jaw slackened. The final, microscopic spark of hope in his eyes extinguished entirely, leaving nothing but a hollow, vacant void. He recognized the absolute finality of his execution. An agent grabbed the back of Nolan's collar, hauling him backward, dragging him away from the stage and into the crushing grip of the federal justice system. 3 hours elapsed. The chaotic, blinding spectacle of the naval auditorium faded, replaced by the sterile, subterranean silence of a naval criminal investigative service holding facility. I stood in the darkness of a secured observation bunker. The ambient temperature hovered near freezing, chilling the circulated air to match the exact temperature of my circulating blood. The only illumination bled from a wall of high-definition monitors suspended above a sprawling control console. Admiral Elias Thorne stood directly beside me. He held a ceramic mug of black coffee, the steam rising in thin, wispy columns. The 4-star admiral did not speak. His posture remained a rigid column of military discipline. He kept his eyes locked onto the glowing screens, watching the absolute destruction of a corrupt dynasty unfold in real time. The federal tactical teams had processed the prisoners. They stripped the billionaires of their designer belts, their silk neckties, and their polished shoelaces, eradicating their civilian armor. The facility housed 3 distinct, windowless interrogation rooms. Thick cinderblock walls and heavy steel doors isolated the suspects entirely. They sat in separate concrete boxes, completely blind to the external world. Yet the digital audio feeds piped their every frantic, hyperventilating breath directly into our overhead speakers. The illusion of their impenetrable family loyalty disintegrated faster than a sugar cube dropped into boiling water. I focused my attention on the monitor displaying Room Alpha. Nolan sat hunched over a scarred metal table, the manipulative, calculating chief financial officer who spent months gaslighting my reality now resembled a hollowed-out, shivering shell. His bespoke suit jacket lay crumpled on the floor. Sweat soaked through the armpits and collar of his white cotton shirt. He dragged his trembling fingers through his hair, gripping the roots, rocking his torso back and forth in a steady, rhythmic motion of sheer panic. 2 federal agents flanked the table. They did not shout. They did not employ aggressive, theatrical interrogation tactics. They simply opened a thick manila file and began laying out the physical printouts of his intercepted text messages. They placed the Cypress Bank routing numbers and the Teterboro Airport flight manifests directly in front of his bloodshot eyes. The crushing, undeniable weight of the evidence broke his spine entirely. Nolan did not invoke his right to legal counsel. He did not attempt to maintain a stoic, unified defense. He threw his accomplices to the wolves with breathtaking, desperate velocity. "I did not authorize the materials," Nolan shrieked, his voice cracked, rising into a pathetic, high-pitched wail that echoed through our speakers. Tears breached his eyelids, carving jagged tracks through the grime and sweat coating his face. "I am just the accountant. Trent orchestrated the supply chain. Trent negotiated the manufacturing contracts in Southeast Asia. He ordered the polymer substitutions. He knew the plates would shatter. I just balanced the ledgers to keep my job." He slammed his palms against the metal table, begging the impassive federal agents to absorb his confession. "Take Trent," Nolan sobbed, his chest heaving as he actively cannibalized his own brother-in-law. "I can give you the operational timelines. I can give you the warehouse coordinates, just grant me immunity." Simone handled the domestic lobbying cover-ups. "Take her, too. She knew everything. Just do not send me to Leavenworth." I stared at the monitor, my expression a mask of chipped flint. The man who attempted to frame me for international espionage in the dead of night now wept like a cornered rat, completely abandoning the mistress he promised to whisk away to a tropical sanctuary. I shifted my gaze to the monitor displaying Room Bravo. Trent paced the length of his concrete cell. He walked with a frantic, limping gait, favoring his right knee. A thick, purple contusion swelled beneath his eye, marking the exact point where his face collided with the auditorium stage. Dried blood crusted along his cheekbone. A senior investigator entered his room and tossed an audio playback device onto the table. The agent pressed a button. Nolan's hysterical, sobbing confession expressly detailing Trent's authorization of the defective ballistic polymers filled the interrogation room. Trent froze. The manic pacing ceased. He stared at the audio device, his jaw unhinging as the reality of Nolan's betrayal struck his nervous system. His towering, malignant narcissism instantly mutated into vicious, feral self-preservation. "He is lying!" Trent screamed, spittle flying from his lips as he lunged toward the table. "Nolan is a desperate, parasitic liar." Trent grabbed the edges of the metal table, leaning forward to scream directly at the federal investigator. "You want the architect of the Cyprus accounts?" Trent bellowed, his vocal cords straining against the volume. "Look at my father. Wallace built the entire offshore network. He established the shell companies 40 years ago. I was just a figurehead. Wallace bribed the procurement officers. He threatened to cut me out of the corporate trust if I did not sign the polymer import manifests. My father is the traitor. Arrest him. Audit his personal accounts. I was a victim of his systemic abuse." He executed his own father without a microsecond of hesitation. The loyalty forged over a decade of mocking my civilian cover and hoarding federal wealth vanished into the sterile, frigid air of the interrogation facility. Admiral Thorne took a slow sip of his black coffee. He lowered the ceramic mug, turning his head to look at me. The harsh light of the monitors illuminated the deep, weathered lines mapping his face. Thorne offered a slow, deliberate nod of grim satisfaction. The execution was flawless. The enemy infrastructure imploded, detonated entirely by their own inherent, toxic greed. I looked at the final monitor. Room Charlie. Wallace sat immobilized in his metal chair. The federal agents had confiscated his silver-tipped walking cane, at 68 years old. The patriarch of the Fisher dynasty appeared completely hollowed out, a deflated, wheezing relic of obsolete corruption. An agent sat across from him, holding a digital tablet. The investigator played the video feed of Trent, shifting the entirety of the federal treason onto his father's shoulders. Wallace did not scream. He did not weep. He simply stared at the screen, watching his legacy devour itself. The son he groomed to inherit his empire had just handed him a terminal sentence in a federal penitentiary. Wallace closed his eyes, his chin dropping heavily to his chest, his breathing reduced to a shallow, ragged rasp. The dynasty was dead. I turned away from the wall of monitors. I reached down to the control console. I picked up a thick, heavy stock portfolio bound in a black leather cover. The documents inside required no further forensic auditing. They represented the final, administrative closure of my domestic operation. I did not ask Admiral Thorne for permission to break the observation protocol. I simply walked toward the heavy steel door at the rear of the bunker. I pushed the barricade open, stepping out into the brightly lit, linoleum-tiled corridor linking the interrogation cells. The sharp, rhythmic click of my uniform shoes echoed against the cinder-block walls. I bypassed Room Charlie. I bypassed Room Bravo. I stopped directly in front of the reinforced steel door securing Room Alpha. 2 armed military police officers flanked the entrance. They snapped to attention, their boots slamming together, their right hands snapping to their brows in crisp salutes. "Open it," I commanded. The officer on the right swiped a magnetic keycard through the terminal and depressed a heavy metal lever. The steel door unsealed with a sharp, pneumatic hiss, swinging outward on heavy industrial hinges. I stepped across the threshold. The 2 federal agents actively interrogating Nolan stopped speaking immediately. They recognized the 3 silver stars pinned to my stark white collar. They gathered their files, offering respectful nods, and seamlessly evacuated the room, pulling the heavy steel door partially shut behind them. Nolan remained hunched over the table, his face buried in his trembling hands. The sharp click of the door mechanism caused him to flinch. He slowly raised his head, expecting to see a federal prosecutor carrying his indictment paperwork. He saw me. The breath died in his throat. His bloodshot eyes widened, tracking the pristine fabric of my service dress uniform, the rows of combat commendations, and the absolute, glacial calm radiating from my posture. He searched my face for a microscopic fracture of empathy, a lingering shadow of the wife who used to pour his wine and pack his lunches. He found a cyber warfare commander standing over the ashes of his life. "Maria," Nolan gasped, his voice broke, reducing to a pathetic, rattling whisper. He pushed himself up slightly from the chair, reaching a shaking hand across the scarred metal table. "Please, I lost my mind. The money, the pressure. It destroyed me. I can help your team. I can testify against Trent. I can testify against Wallace. Just tell them I cooperated. Tell them I was sick." He begged for salvation. He offered to burn his accomplices to secure a lighter sentence, desperately hoping I still harbored the capacity to pity him. I did not utter a single syllable. I did not blink. I stepped up to the edge of this table. I raised my right hand and released my grip on the black leather portfolio. The heavy document dropped. It slapped against the scarred metal surface with a sharp, concussive crack, severing his pathetic pleas instantly. The portfolio contained the finalized, expedited divorce decrees, permanently dissolving our 7-year marriage. It contained the absolute, unyielding asset seizure authorizations, legally stripping him of his luxury vehicles, his residential equity, and every single dollar resting in his domestic banking accounts. It left him with absolutely nothing but the sweat soaking his ruined shirt and the federal indictment waiting to transport him to Leavenworth. Nolan stared down at the black leather cover. His trembling fingers hovered over the documents, terrified to touch the physical manifestation of his total annihilation. I did not wait for him to open the file. I did not wait for him to process his new reality. I turned my back on the broken, sobbing man. I walked out of the interrogation room, my uniform shoes striking the linoleum with crisp, measured finality. I stepped into the corridor, and the heavy steel door slammed shut behind me, locking the deadbolt with a solid, echoing thud. 6 months passed. The subterranean air of the United States Navy Cyber Command Center tasted of filtered oxygen and chilled copper. I stood on the elevated glass bridge, looking out over the sprawling operations floor. Dozens of analysts manned their illuminated terminals, tracking global maritime threats and securing federal defense grids. The low, rhythmic hum of the server banks resonated through the soles of my polished uniform shoes. A steady, mechanical heartbeat anchoring my reality. I rested my hands on the stainless steel railing. I did not wear the drab, oversized wool trench coat. I did not hide behind the fabricated persona of a fragile, forgetful clerk. I wore the crisp, pristine whites of a vice admiral, the 3 silver stars anchored firmly to my collar. My rank remained absolute. My peace remained entirely secure. The storm that obliterated my family concluded 4 weeks prior inside a federal courthouse. The Department of Justice did not negotiate. The federal prosecutors did not entertain plea agreements. Armed with the catastrophic, irrefutable digital dossiers I extracted from Nolan's encrypted drives, the government executed a legal slaughter. Wallace Fisher, the retired lobbyist who spent 4 decades manipulating the shadowy corridors of Washington, traded his sprawling country club estate for an 8x10 concrete box. The judge handed him a 20-year sentence in a federal penitentiary for defrauding the Department of Defense. My father no longer grips a silver-tipped walking cane. He grips the steel bars of a cell door. He wears a standard-issue khaki jumpsuit, his heavy jowls sagging under the harsh fluorescent glare of the prison block, stripped completely of his untouchable arrogance. Trent occupies a cell in the adjacent maximum security wing. The billionaire chief executive officer who mocked my government salary now earns 12 cents an hour folding laundry in the prison facility. He received his own 20-year sentence. The federal authorities seized Fisher Logistics entirely, dismantling the corporate infrastructure and auctioning his fleet of luxury sports cars to compensate the defrauded taxpayers. The bespoke Italian suits he weaponized to project dominance rot in a government storage unit. He possesses no power. He commands no one. Simone, the ambitious lobbyist who eagerly plotted to share my stolen marital assets, never boarded the private charter jet at Teterboro Airport. Federal marshals intercepted her outside her luxury condominium. She currently awaits trial, formally indicted as a primary co-conspirator in the international money laundering operation. The government seized her bank accounts and confiscated the designer red leather handbag purchased with stolen military capital. She traded the penthouse suite and the vintage champagne for a metal table in a holding facility. Then there is Nolan. The man who orchestrated the midnight frame job resides in the United States Penitentiary, Leavenworth. The federal prosecutors leveraged the stolen Naval Sea Systems Command schematics to secure convictions for both massive wire fraud and domestic espionage. He will never breathe free civilian air again. The divorce decrees I dropped on the interrogation room table finalized rapidly. The asset seizure authorization stripped him of the suburban residence, the luxury sedans, and the hidden offshore wealth. He possesses absolutely $0. He sleeps on a thin foam mattress, staring at a cinderblock wall, trapped forever inside the exact nightmare he meticulously engineered for his wife. He attempted to weaponize my mind, intending to bury me in a psychiatric facility or a foreign prison. Instead, I audited his treason, cloned his digital footprints, and marched him directly to the gallows. I released my grip on the steel railing. I turned away from the operations floor and walked toward my glass command module. The overarching narrative woven through this operation illuminates a profound truth. Your inherent self-worth is never dictated by those who refuse to see it. For 10 years, I allowed men consumed by their own towering vanity to treat my quiet endurance as a symptom of weakness. They mistook my silence for ignorance. They believed my compartmentalized life rendered me a helpless, disposable pawn. When toxic people mistake your quiet endurance for weakness, they inevitably build the very traps that will destroy them. Their arrogance blinds them to the microscopic details. They underestimate the target, assuming their victim will simply collapse under the weight of their manipulation. True power does not require volume, arrogance, or a desperate need for external validation. It does not demand a fleet of luxury vehicles or a seat at the head of a mahogany dining table. True power requires absolute competence and the patience to let the truth execute its own justice. When you stop fighting to be valued by parasites committed to misunderstanding you, you reclaim the battlefield, you map their vulnerabilities, you secure your perimeter, you step back, and you let their own unchecked greed lock the heavy steel doors behind them. If you have ever had to draw a hard line and let a narcissist build their own cage, share your story in the comments below. Hit the like button, subscribe for more stories of absolute justice, and thank you for watching. Goodbye.